I never thought I'd find myself here, standing on the cracked asphalt of a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Black Hollow. The name itself carries a weight, like a warning whispered on the wind. The sign at the edge of town had long since rotted, the letters warped by sun and rain, but I could still make out the words if I squinted hard enough. A welcome of sorts, though it felt more like a farewell. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds that barely moved. No birds called, no wind stirred. It was the sort of silence that pressed against your ears, filling them with its own absence. I stepped forward slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel that had overtaken the road. The town lay in ruins before me, a scattering of broken buildings, rusted machinery, and skeletal trees that reached skyward like pleading fingers. I had read about Black Hollow in old mining records and local newspapers, a town that had thrived decades ago and then disappeared almost overnight. They said the mine had closed, the owners left, and the families followed, leaving behind only their houses and memories. But now, as I walked deeper into the empty streets, I sensed something off. Something that felt alive, if not exactly human. The first house I passed was a two-story wooden frame, its windows shattered and walls leaning, yet the door stood oddly ajar, swaying slightly as if inviting me inside. I hesitated. There was dust everywhere, covering the floor like a soft, gray carpet. But then I noticed the footprints. They weren't old. They led from the doorway toward the back of the house, and they weren't mine. I froze. My breath caught somewhere in my chest. I told myself it could be an animal, or maybe the wind had shifted some debris. Rational explanations, thin as they were, tried to blanket my nerves. But the footprints, fresh, human-shaped, and too deliberate, pulled at something deeper in my mind. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Not a fire burning now, but an old, lingering smell like charred wood from a long-forgotten blaze. It seemed to come from the center of the town, where the mine's old entrance yawned like a black hole. I felt drawn there, though part of me resisted. There was something about abandoned towns, something about places where people had left in a hurry, that makes your imagination fill the void with shadows. I continued down the street, passing a collapsed general store. Broken shelves lay scattered, cans and bottles strewn across the dirt floor. The walls were covered in faded posters, advertisements for products I barely recognized, with dates that made my stomach twist. 1947, 1953, 1961. And yet, amid all the decay, there were signs of movement. An empty coffee cup on the counter, a chair turned slightly, as if someone had just stood and left in a hurry. The further I went, the more the town seemed to come alive, not with people but with traces of presence. I heard the creak of wood under some unseen weight, the soft clatter of metal that could have been wind or footsteps. I told myself again, it was the wind. But my eyes kept darting, searching, trying to catch something that was always just out of reach. I reached the town square, where a rusted fountain sat dry and cracked. The buildings surrounding it leaned at impossible angles. One had a collapsed roof. Another's windows were boarded up, but not all of them. I noticed something in the shadow of the boarded window, a shape, brief and indistinct. It was gone before I could be certain, leaving only the lingering sense that I had not been alone in that square. The mine entrance beckoned next. Its metal supports were corroded, the wooden beams rotted and brittle. The opening was wide and dark, and a cold draft carried from it, brushing my face like a warning. I knelt down at the edge, peering inside. The darkness seemed thicker than mere shadow, a black that resisted the weak light filtering from outside. And yet I thought I could see movement within, a flicker, like a figure shifting in the shadows. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and pressed my back against the nearest building. I tried to rationalize what I had just seen, but the rational explanation slipped through my fingers like smoke. My mind began to wander, filling the empty town with memories it could never have known. I imagined miners leaving for the last time, their families packing in silence, whispers of arguments and sudden disappearances. And in that imagination, the town seemed to watch me back, aware of my trespass in ways I couldn't explain. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to explore further. There was a strange pull here, a story that needed uncovering, though I could not yet name it. The wind shifted again, and for the first time I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound of voices. Not clear words, just the echo of human presence. They rose and fell with the wind, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. My chest tightened. I could feel a low hum of tension threading through the empty streets. I wandered past more houses, noting the small, unsettling details. A broken doll, its eyes missing, sat on a porch. A chair, turned perfectly upright in an abandoned kitchen, seemed as if someone might sit there at any moment. And then I found the mailbox that still held letters. Not old, decayed letters, but recent ones. I hesitated before picking one up, noting the handwriting. Hurried, almost frantic. I didn't read it. Something in me knew it wasn't meant for me. As the sun began to dip lower, I noticed how the shadows lengthened unnaturally. They pooled in corners, clinging to walls and door frames as if reluctant to let go. The houses seemed to lean closer, the streets narrowing in subtle ways that made it feel impossible to walk straight. My mind tried to laugh it off, but the laughter felt hollow. I was being watched, not by eyes I could see, but by memory and presence, lingering in the town like a second skin. Finally, I found a small cabin at the edge of the town, near the mine entrance. The door was intact, the windows mostly whole. It seemed safe, if only by contrast. I entered slowly, feeling the floorboards protest beneath me. Dust rose in tiny clouds, catching the dim light. There was a table, a chair, and a small stove, all coated in decades of neglect. Yet on the table lay a fresh piece of chalk, with a drawing that I couldn't identify at first. Lines and shapes that suggested a map, or maybe a warning. I sank into the chair, exhausted and tense. I didn't know what had drawn me here to Black Hollow, or what I might find if I dared explore deeper. But one thing was certain: this town was not entirely dead. It moved in ways I couldn't name, breathed in ways I couldn't hear, and waited. And I had arrived. I hesitated at the entrance of the mine, the heavy air spilling out in a chill that wrapped around my skin and settled deep in my chest. The wooden supports groaned under some unseen weight, and the metal gate, half rusted shut, seemed to watch me as I edged closer. I had read about mines before, seen them in photographs, read the tragic stories of accidents and disappearances, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of stepping into one. It was as though the darkness had a voice, low and persistent, calling to me in a language I almost recognized. I fumbled for my flashlight and switched it on. The narrow beam cut through the blackness, illuminating splinters of wood, scattered rocks, and the occasional piece of old mining equipment. Everything was coated in decades of dust, yet the mine smelled faintly of damp earth and rust. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself that it was only the air, the silence, and my imagination conspiring together. But there was something else, a subtle vibration beneath my feet, almost like a heartbeat. I stepped inside. The walls were jagged and slick with moisture, the floor uneven and littered with debris. I moved slowly, every step deliberate, trying to make as little noise as possible. Somewhere far ahead, water dripped steadily, echoing through the shaft, punctuating the silence like a metronome for a song I could not hear. My light caught something on the floor, a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and pages yellow. I knelt down and flipped it open. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. Dates, names, and notes about shipments of ore, complaints about the ventilation, mentions of minor injuries. But then there were entries that made my stomach tight. Names of miners followed by strange annotations. Gone, never returned, heard crying, found footprints leading deeper. I traced the words with my finger, feeling an odd intimacy with someone who had vanished long before I had arrived. The words seemed to echo in my mind, and for a moment I could almost hear the scratch of the pen. The careful recording of life and disappearance in a place that didn't allow for either. I continued further, the mine narrowing into a tight corridor. The air grew heavier, damp and oppressive, making every breath a small effort. My flashlight flickered and I tapped it against my hand, willing it to hold steady. Shadows danced on the walls, shadows that weren't mine, moving slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was a trick of the light. the uneven surfaces creating shapes my mind wanted to recognize as human. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle like the dragging of feet over gravel. I froze, the beam of my light trembling as my hand shook. I told myself it was probably a rat, or maybe a rock falling from the ceiling, but the sound had a rhythm, deliberate, almost measured. I strained to listen, letting the echoes travel, following them deeper into the shaft. The corridor split into smaller tunnels, branching like veins, and the sound seemed to come from all of them at once and nowhere at the same time. I chose the left path, guided more by instinct than reason. The walls narrowed further and I brushed against jagged rock, leaving streaks of dust along my sleeve. And then I saw them, personal items scattered and half buried in dirt. A worn-out boot, a miner's helmet, a broken lantern. I knelt to inspect them. The helmet was dented, the inside lined with years of grime, but there was something unmistakable, fresh scratches, faint marks that couldn't have been decades old. My heart skipped a beat. I shook my head, trying to force a rational thought. Maybe animals, I told myself. Maybe I just imagined the scratches, but deep down I knew I hadn't. Further down, the tunnel opened slightly into a wider chamber. My flashlight caught the glint of metal tools left abandoned, pickaxes and shovels leaning against the walls. And then I saw the footprints. Small, human-shaped depressions in the fine dirt, leading from the chamber into an even darker corridor. I froze. They were fresh. I could see the impressions clearly, the way the dust had been disturbed recently. No one had been here for decades, or had they? The sound came again then. A whisper, faint and fragmented, almost carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, just syllables, tones that didn't belong to the mine itself. My breath caught and I pressed my back to the wall, trying to convince myself that it was the mine settling, that my mind was playing tricks. But the voice, or whatever it was, kept moving, circling, shifting just beyond the reach of my light. I forced myself to move forward, one careful step at a time. The chamber narrowed again, leading to a descending shaft, damp and slippery. I followed the footprints, my hand brushing against the wet stone, every nerve in my body screaming to turn back. But there was a compulsion, a need to see, to understand. The mind seemed alive in a way that made no sense. It breathed with me, moved around me, and yet it resisted me, hiding its deepest secrets in the darkness ahead. Then I saw it writing on the walls, scratched into the stone with some sharp object. Words faint and jagged, they never left. I traced them with my finger, my hand trembling. The writing was recent, the scratches sharp against the smooth stone. My mind raced. How could anyone be here? How could they survive, hidden in this dead place for so long? And what did they mean by never left? The whispering grew louder, closer now, though I could see no one. I stepped back, heart pounding, trying to understand. It wasn't anger or threat in the sound. It was something quieter, persistent, as if the mine itself were speaking to me. A warning, a plea, or simply a reminder that I had trespassed into a place that remembered far more than I ever could. I reached a ladder leading down into the darkness. Rusted, barely holding its shape, it descended into a pit that seemed endless. The footprints ended at the ladder's base, as though someone had climbed down into a world I wasn't meant to enter. I swallowed, feeling the weight of the mine pressing down, pressing into my chest. My flashlight flickered again, and I thought I saw movement below. A figure, or a shadow, shifting just beyond comprehension. I wanted to run, to leave this place and never return. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I knelt again, examining the area near the ladder. Among the scattered tools, I found a locket partially buried in dust. I opened it. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a young man, smiling, dressed in a miner's uniform. A name scratched into the metal, Elias Horn. I whispered it to myself, feeling the mind respond in a low, almost human groan. The name seemed to echo, carried through the tunnels, and for a moment I imagined someone, or something, listening. I turned my gaze back to the descending ladder. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and almost tangible, wrapping around me like a net. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone living down here, hidden in the darkness, observing me. Or maybe it wasn't someone at all. Maybe it was the mine itself, alive in memory and shadow, unwilling to release the lives it had consumed. I took a deep breath and stepped back. I couldn't go down, at least not yet. The mine was a living story, whispering through time, and I was only a visitor. Every sound, every shadow, every footprint and scratched word told me that the town above was not entirely abandoned, that some part of it lingered below, hidden, waiting. I rose slowly, brushing the dust from my hands. The whispering receded, replaced by the familiar drip of water and the echo of my own heartbeat. But I could still feel eyes, or something like eyes, on me from the depths below. I stepped back toward the shaft's entrance, my mind heavy with the knowledge that I had touched the edges of something that was not fully gone, not fully alive, but certainly not dead. And as I climbed back into the light of the open sky, I realized that Black Hollow was a town that kept its secrets in the dark, that beneath the surface, in tunnels and chambers long forgotten, echoes of the past waited, listening, watching, and I had heard them. The sun was low when I left the mine behind, spilling long shadows across the streets of Black Hollow. The light was soft, almost golden, but it carried a coldness with it, a subtle unease that made every building seem to lean closer than it should. I walked toward the miners' barracks, a row of wooden shacks on the far edge of town, their paint long flaked away by wind and rain. Each one sagged under its own age, windows broken or boarded up, but still, they seemed almost alive in their decay, aware of my presence. As I drew nearer, I noticed a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, a whisper, soft and carried on the wind. I stopped and held my breath, straining to hear. It wasn't a single voice, but many fragmented, overlapping, impossible to fully catch. Words dissolved as soon as they reached my ears. Pleas, warnings, maybe even laughter, though it was hollow and brittle, like the echoes of a long-dead crowd. My stomach tight. I had expected silence here, complete and absolute, yet this was something else, something alive in its own, quiet way. I approached the first barracks cautiously, the whispering seeming to grow, more insistent but always just out of comprehension. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the dusk, revealing peeling boards, cracked walls, and the occasional personal item left behind. A boot, a broken chair, a rusted pot. But what caught my eye were the markings on the side of the building. Graffiti, crude and sharp, scratched into the wood. Names, dates, and strange symbols. Some names I recognized from the mine's notebook. Miners who had vanished, listed as never returned or missing. My hands went cold. Someone or something had carved reminders into the walls. Warnings, maybe, or memories. I ran my fingers lightly over one of the carvings. Don't go deeper. The words were jagged, hurried, almost desperate. I swallowed hard, trying to remind myself that this was a town long abandoned, that the people who lived here had left decades ago. But the whispers grew louder, weaving around me, curling in my hair, pressing against my ears. I couldn't ignore them. They pulled me forward, urging me to move from barracks to barracks, as if leading me somewhere I couldn't yet understand. The air shifted, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of smoke and wet earth. My flashlight flickered briefly and I blinked, seeing movement at the edge of the beam. Nothing fully formed, just a shimmer in the shadows, a hint of shape. I told myself it was my mind, stressed and tired, imagining figures where there were none. Yet the whispering seemed to respond to me, ebbing and flowing, faintly calling my name. Or at least, what I thought sounded like my name. My pulse quickened. But my feet carried me forward anyway. I reached the center of the barracks, where the buildings formed a rough courtyard. The ground was covered in dead leaves and scattered boards, and the shadows pooled like ink in the corners. I stopped near an old well, its stones cracked and moss-covered. Here, the whispers shifted, changing tone, quieter now, more deliberate. I could almost make out fragments. They know, can't leave, watch. The words vanished if I tried to focus, leaving only the heavy, suffocating silence that followed each fleeting sound. Leaning closer to the barracks, I found more graffiti. Some were simple names, scratched over and over, layered like centuries of memory. Others were phrases. She is still here. We never left. He waits in the dark. I traced the letters with my fingers, feeling the rough wood beneath the skin of my hand. My mind raced with possibilities. Messages from the past, or warnings from someone or something that remained behind, refusing to leave. The longer I stared, the more the words seemed to twist and writhe in my vision, almost alive in the dim light. A sudden shift in the wind made the door to one of the barracks creak. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't touched it. My hand rose instinctively to the flashlight, scanning the interior. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching the last golden rays of sunlight. The room was empty, yet I felt a presence, subtle but undeniable, like the weight of unseen eyes. I took a tentative step inside, each creak of the floorboards echoing unnaturally in the quiet. Inside, the barracks were more intact than I expected. Beds, once lined up neatly, were now warped and collapsed. Personal belongings remained. A hat here, a coat there, a broken comb on the floor. It struck me how quickly life had ended in these rooms, or perhaps how quickly it had fled. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the faint rustle of wind through cracks in the walls. And yet I could feel something pressing at my back, an intangible weight that didn't belong to me. I moved to the far wall and found more graffiti, smaller this time, almost hidden in the corner near the floor. A child's handwriting, trembling and uneven, carved into the wood. He took them. Don't follow. My stomach churned. Who were they, and who or what was he? I pressed my palm to the wall, feeling the rough grain beneath my fingers, and for a fleeting moment I thought I could sense the fear that had been left behind, etched into the wood like a memory that refused to die. The sun dipped lower, painting the barracks in shades of bruised purple and gray. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching across the courtyard and spilling into the buildings. I realized that I had been here longer than I intended, caught in a strange trance of exploration and dread. I turned, intending to leave, and caught something moving at the edge of my light. A figure, pale and indistinct, standing just beyond the doorframe. I froze. My mind screamed for explanation. A trick of the light, a shadow cast by the wind. Yet my body tensed, certain that what I had seen was neither illusion nor accident. The whispering returned then, louder, circling around me like smoke. Words brushed my ears, again almost intelligible. You shouldn't be here, listen, follow. I shook my head, trying to chase the voices away, but the sound persisted, wrapping around my consciousness, threading into my thoughts. I realized that the mind, the barracks, the town itself seemed alive. Not with people, but with memory, with lingering fragments of the lives that had once occupied these spaces. And those fragments were not friendly. I stepped outside, the chill of the dusk pressing against my skin. The whispering softened but did not stop. It followed me across the courtyard, curling around the buildings, clinging to the shadows in ways that made my pulse quicken. I glanced back at the barracks, and in the dimming light, I could swear I saw figures moving just beyond the edges of my vision, silent, watching, waiting. I walked slowly back toward the street, my flashlight illuminating broken fences, abandoned carts, and the skeletal remains of trees. The graffiti, the whispers, the scattered belongings, they all left me with a creeping sense of unease. Black Hollow was not entirely dead. It held memories, fears, and fragments of lives that had ended abruptly, and in some inexplicable way, it remembered me as well. The air grew colder still, carrying the faint scent of earth and rot. My ears caught the softest movement, something brushing across the ground behind me. I spun, flashlight swinging, but there was nothing. Only the whispering, fading now, receding into the distance as the sun disappeared completely, leaving only twilight. I paused at the edge of the barracks, taking a deep breath. The feeling of being observed lingered, almost tangible. The graffiti, the whispers, the shadows, they were warnings, perhaps, or remnants of the unsolved disappearances that had plagued this town. I could feel the weight of the stories pressing down, pressing against my mind in the growing darkness. And I understood, suddenly, that some things in Black Hollow did not wish to be forgotten. I turned away from the barracks and started walking back toward the center of town, my steps slow and deliberate. Every sound, every shift of shadow kept me alert. I was not alone, even if I could see no one. And I knew that the whispers would follow me, curling around my mind until I left, or until I too became part of the memory they refused to release. Night was falling over Black Hollow. The last traces of sunlight faded behind the jagged horizon, leaving the town draped in gray shadows that deepened with every step I took. The streets, already empty and silent during the day, now seemed to breathe, shifting in the darkness. Each building loomed larger, their outlines jagged and alien, like distorted memories of what they had once been. My flashlight offered only a narrow beam, barely touching the corners of the crumbling facades, and the shadows beyond it stretched like long fingers reaching for me. I paused at the edge of the street, trying to steady my breathing. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decaying wood. Somewhere far away, the echo of dripping water reached me, irregular and distant. I told myself it was just that, a sound bouncing through the empty town, but it made my skin prickle. I could not shake the feeling that the town was watching, that it had waited decades for someone to return, and now it was aware of me. As I moved forward, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision. Shadows, too tall and too human to be random. I froze, heart hammering, scanning the street. The figures were just beyond my flashlight, standing silently near a collapsed building. I blinked and they were gone. A trick of the light, I told myself. Buildings leaning in unusual ways, dust drifting across the road. Rational explanations. But the unease settled deep in my chest. Black Hollow had a way of making you question the very air around you. Every sound and shadow, every step. I continued toward the center of town, past the remnants of what had once been a small market. Rusted signs hung crookedly from poles, the faded letters barely legible. Broken crates littered the street, their contents long scavenged or rotted away. My flashlight caught a movement again, a figure, smaller this time, darting between the buildings. I stopped abruptly, my breath catching. I could not see clearly, only glimpses of shape and form, and each time I blinked it was gone. I tried to focus on something concrete, the cracked pavement under my feet, the faint outlines of buildings. But the shadows seemed to twist around me, shifting subtly, almost teasing my perception. One building, a long-abandoned house near the town square, seemed to lean closer, its windows dark and hollow like eyes. I stepped closer, drawn by a mix of curiosity and dread. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin line of air drifted past me, carrying whispers I could almost catch but never fully understand. Inside the house, the floorboards creaked under my weight, though I moved carefully. Dust and debris coated everything, yet the interior seemed strangely preserved, as if someone had been here recently. Small objects, a cup, a book, a child's toy, lay in positions that felt deliberate, not random. I traced my fingers along the edge of a table, feeling the rough grain beneath my skin, and the whispering grew more distinct. Not words exactly, but tones and syllables that tugged at my memory, fragments of conversation I could not place. I stepped outside again, the night thick around me. The figures I had glimpsed before now appeared farther down the street. Tall and thin, their shapes distorted in the weak light of my flashlight, standing motionless. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone was there, but my voice caught in my throat. Part of me hoped they were real, part of me feared that they were not. They did not move as I watched. They did not respond. And yet I felt them observe me, their presence pressing against the edge of perception, heavy and impossible to ignore. I walked cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on the figures. They seemed to retreat when I approached, keeping just beyond reach, almost playful in their elusiveness. My mind raced, conjuring possibilities. Townsfolk who had returned, descendants who had claimed this place as their own, or something else entirely, lingering from the town's dark past. The graffiti, the whispers, the footprints in the mine, they all pointed to a history that did not end with abandonment, a memory that refused to fade. The town square was up ahead, the remains of the fountain cracked and dry, its basin collecting shadows instead of water. I paused there, taking in the ruins. The buildings surrounding it leaned at odd angles, their broken roofs casting jagged lines across the ground. And there, at the far edge of the square, I saw them again. Figures, indistinct, flickering at the edge of vision. One appeared to move slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if aware of my attention. I held my breath, trying to focus, but the moment passed and they were gone, leaving only the heavy, watchful darkness. I moved toward the barracks once more, feeling the weight of the night press down on me. The whispering returned, softer now, almost like a sigh brushing against my ears. I could not place the words, but they carried meaning, hints of warnings or memories of lives lost. I traced the walls with my flashlight, seeing graffiti carved deep into the wood, names, dates, and phrases that spoke of those who had vanished. Never return. He waits. Do not follow. Each word resonated in my mind, echoing against the empty buildings. I stopped at one particular barracks, its door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Inside, the remnants of life were more vivid. A chair tipped over, a small stove blackened with age, and a child's toy lying near the corner. I bent down to pick it up, noting the dust patterns around it. There were footprints, faint and partial, leading toward a back room. My pulse quickened. Fresh, or nearly fresh, despite the decades that had passed. I swallowed hard, sensing that I was not alone, that the night carried more than shadows and wind. I hesitated at the doorway, listening. The whispering intensified, circling around me like smoke. I thought I could catch fragments. Go back, he sees. My skin prickled. Rational thought fought for control, reminding me that I was alone, that these were echoes of memory, not living presence. But the sensation of being watched, of something intangible pressing against me, was undeniable. I stepped back outside, the night fully upon the town. The air was colder now, heavier. Shadows clung to the edges of buildings, stretching and twisting in ways that made the familiar streets seem alien. The figures I had glimpsed before were no longer in the square but lingered in the distance, near the edge of my flashlight's reach. I could not see them clearly, only sense them, shifting subtly in rhythm with the whispering that still surrounded me. I realized then that Black Hollow was not simply abandoned. The town itself remembered, its memory etched into walls, floors, and shadows. It carried fragments of its past like a living presence, lingering long after the people who had lived there were gone. And in some inexplicable way, it was aware of me. Every step I took, every breath I drew, seemed to feed that awareness, to deepen the connection between my own presence and the town's lingering spirit. I moved slowly toward the main street, the buildings on either side leaning slightly inward as if to observe. The whispering ebbed and flowed, now teasing, now insistent, and I felt an almost physical weight pressing at my shoulders. My flashlight caught glimpses of movement at the corners of my vision, shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. My mind struggled to maintain reason, to separate imagination from reality, but the lines were blurred and the night deepened. I paused at the intersection where the old post office had once stood. Its walls were cracked, windows shattered, and the door swung loosely on its hinges. I scanned the street beyond, and for a moment the shadows seemed to converge, growing darker, heavier. The sense of being observed intensified. I thought of the miners, the families, the vanished townsfolk. Had they left, or had something remained, tethered to the place, unwilling to move on? A sudden shift in the wind stirred the loose papers and debris on the street, and I thought I saw a figure at the far end, near the edge of the forest that bordered the town. It was taller than a person should be, elongated and distorted in the dim light. I blinked. It vanished. I stepped forward cautiously, each footfall measured, every sense heightened. The whispering brushed my ears again, fleeting phrases I could not fully grasp, carrying a weight of warning, memory, and something else, something older. I knew I could not stay long. The night was deepening, and the shadows were no longer just shadows. Black Hollow had revealed a fraction of itself, enough to unsettle, enough to warn. But I felt drawn forward, compelled to explore further, to understand the presence that lingered in every corner, every ruin, every whisper carried on the wind. I took one last look at the barracks, the graffiti, the shadows among the ruins. Something moved at the edge of my vision, and for a moment I thought I saw eyes watching me, human or not. I turned and walked back toward the center of town, heart heavy, senses alert. The town was alive in memory, in absence, in the spaces between light and shadow, and I knew with a quiet certainty that I had only begun to scratch the surface. Black Hollow did not forgive curiosity. It did not allow intruders to remain untouched by its history. And as I moved deeper into the night, I felt that its eyes, whatever they truly were, followed me, patient, unblinking and waiting for what came next. I arrived in Cedar Creek just as the sun began to sink behind the trees, painting the town in shades of bruised orange and muted gray. The road leading in was cracked and overgrown, weeds forcing their way through the asphalt, and every mile seemed to pull me deeper into a place forgotten by time. There were no signs of life, no sound beyond the occasional creak of a distant branch swaying in the wind. I parked at what might have once been the center of town, near a crumbling sign that read, "Welcome to Cedar Creek," the letters half broken and faded to near invisibility. Stepping out of the car, I felt the air change. It was heavier here, carrying the faint scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something older, something that made my skin prickle. The street stretched ahead, lined with houses in various stages of decay. Roofs had caved in, windows gaped open like hollow eyes, and paint peeled in long, curling strips. Yet despite the ruin, it was clear people had once lived here. I could see remnants of gardens, paths cleared through weeds, fences that had been maintained, if only briefly. I walked slowly, boots crunching on gravel and broken wood. The town felt suspended in some strange limbo, as if the people had vanished in the middle of their daily routines. Doors stood slightly ajar, curtains fluttering in the cold breeze, leaving dark interiors that seemed to watch me as I passed. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and dread. Each house carried its own memory, silent yet present, whispering faintly in the corners of my mind. I approached the first home on the left, a two-story house with a sagging porch and a tree pressing against its side. The door hung crookedly, and stepping inside, I was greeted by the scent of mold and decay. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and dust motes floated lazily in the narrow beam of my flashlight. On a small table near the window lay a stack of papers, letters, yellowed and brittle, tied together with a faded ribbon. I knelt to examine them, my fingers brushing over the fragile edges. The letters were from neighbors, family, friends. They spoke of everyday things, complaints about a broken well, news of a child's illness, small celebrations that had once marked the passing of time. But then the tone shifted in the later letters, subtle at first. Mentions of people not returning from walks, neighbors disappearing overnight, the unsettling absence of friends who had once been seen daily. I traced the words carefully, feeling a shiver run down my spine. These were not just letters. They were echoes of lives that had simply been swallowed by something unseen. I left the house quietly, stepping onto the porch. The wind carried faint whispers, voices that might have been part of the town's memory, or perhaps just my own imagination twisting sound into something meaningful. I shook my head and moved on, following the street deeper into Cedar Creek. The overgrowth pressed in on both sides, trees and vines reclaiming space once held by people. I noticed mailboxes, rusted and tilted, some still holding envelopes, their contents yellowed and fragile. One mailbox contained a small diary, its leather cover cracked and soft. I flipped it open carefully. The entries began innocuously enough, descriptions of daily chores, small joys, and frustrations. But as I read on, the tone shifted, subtle but insistent. The writer spoke of seeing figures at the edge of the woods, hearing voices when no one was there, and feeling the weight of eyes watching from the empty streets. The final entry was unfinished, interrupted mid-sentence, as if the writer had been forced away from the page. I traced the words slowly, imagining the fear, the confusion, the helplessness they must have felt. Moving further down the street, the houses became more derelict. Roofs had collapsed entirely, walls were cracked, and windows were shattered. Yet in some homes I found objects left behind. A child's shoes neatly placed by the doorway, a chair tipped over as if someone had left in a hurry, a kettle on the stove long cold. The details suggested sudden departure, a life interrupted, a town abandoned without explanation. I shivered, realizing that every object carried a story, a trace of existence that refused to fade entirely. The street curved slightly, and I came to what had once been the main square. A small park, overgrown and wild, contained the remnants of a fountain, now cracked and dry. A rusted swing swayed gently in the wind. The buildings around the square leaned inward, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, unnatural and heavy. I felt a pressure in my chest, a combination of awe and unease. The town seemed to breathe, holding memories of those who had vanished, preserving them in air and wood and stone. Near the square, I found a small house, its front door partially blocked by fallen beams. I squeezed through, careful not to make too much noise. Inside, a table held scattered papers, more diaries, notes, letters, some unfinished, others folded neatly as if someone had intended to return. One diary was particularly striking. It told the story of a family who had noticed neighbors disappearing one by one, leaving only letters behind. The entries spoke of fear, of confusion, of quiet panic that built slowly, like water rising unnoticed until it could no longer be contained. I read the last few entries carefully. They were abrupt, almost frantic, describing noises in the night, shadows moving beyond vision, and the growing sense that something watched the town. Then the diary ended. No explanation, no resolution, only blank pages. I closed it gently, feeling the weight of the unspoken, the vanished, the unresolved. The silence of the house pressed against me, heavy and expectant. Outside again, I walked toward the outskirts of town. The streets narrowed, the vegetation thicker, pressing against the edges of the road. I noticed footprints in the dust, faint but distinct, leading toward a narrow path through the trees. I paused. The footprints were human-sized, too precise to be random, yet they didn't belong to me. My heart quickened. Could someone still be here? Or was this another echo, a memory etched into the town itself? The wind shifted, carrying soft, indistinct sounds. I thought I heard laughter, a child's voice, maybe even whispers of adults, though the sounds were fleeting, impossible to place. I shook my head, telling myself that it was the wind through the trees, the empty town playing tricks on me. Yet the feeling remained. I was being watched, observed by something that did not belong entirely to the present. I pressed on, following the street until it became little more than a trail through overgrown weeds. I passed homes where nature had begun to reclaim everything. Walls collapsed, roofs caved, vines winding through windows and doors. And yet in some corners I found remnants of the lives that had been here. A hat hanging on a nail, a partially open book, a photograph in a broken frame. Each piece suggested someone had vanished suddenly, leaving traces without explanation. The path led me to a small wooden bridge over a creek, water barely moving beneath the moonlight. I stopped, listening to the soft flow, the faint rustle of leaves. Across the water, a small cluster of homes stood, more intact than most I had seen. I could see broken shutters, cracked walls, and empty windows, but the structures themselves suggested they had been maintained at some point, long after the town was supposedly abandoned. My curiosity mingled with unease. Had someone been here recently? Or was the town itself preserving a semblance of life, like a memory frozen in time? I lingered for a moment, the diary and letters heavy in my bag, the fading light making the shadows long and unsettling. Every sound, every rustle, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified in the quiet. Cedar Creek was not merely abandoned. It held its history tightly, refusing to let go, keeping alive the memory of those who had vanished without explanation. And I could feel it, watching, waiting, aware of my presence as I wandered its forgotten streets. Finally, I turned back toward the center of town, the moon rising above the trees, casting pale silver light across broken roads and empty homes. I knew that the streets would remain, the letters and diaries would wait, the echoes of vanished townsfolk lingering in corners, under floors, behind doors. And I knew that somewhere in the quiet, something in Cedar Creek was aware of me, aware that I had arrived, stepping softly through streets where time had stopped, and where the missing had left only shadows and memory behind. I hesitated at the doorway of the old general store, the wood warped and cracked, the paint peeling like dried skin. The sign above swayed slightly in the evening wind, groaning as if complaining about decades of neglect. I pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges letting out a long, thin squeal that echoed down the empty street. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint, musty scent of wood and old paper, but there was something else, a subtle tang of metal, or perhaps rusted cans, that made my stomach twist uneasily. The store was dim, the fatting light of dusk seeping through grimy windows and broken shutters. My flashlight cut a narrow path across the room, illuminating shelves lined with goods long expired, jars coated in layers of dust, and cans whose labels had long since faded. Yet despite the decay, everything was oddly arranged. Items were stacked neatly, some slightly askew as if handled recently. It didn't make sense. Who would have been here after all these years? Who could have moved these things? The thought left me cold, a creeping uncertainty settling over me like a fog. I stepped inside, boots creaking on the warped floorboards. Each step seemed loud in the silence, the sound bouncing off the walls and ceiling. I ran my hand along a shelf, feeling the dust and grime, yet noticing the occasional patch of cleaner surface as though someone had touched it recently. My mind raced. Perhaps animals, but no. The objects were organized too deliberately, jars grouped by size, cans aligned perfectly by height. The level of care suggested a presence, deliberate and conscious, and the thought of someone or something, watching, guiding, unsettled me. I moved toward the counter at the back of the store. Behind it lay a small ledger, yellowed with age, its cover intact but brittle. I opened it slowly, careful not to damage the pages. The entries were mundane at first, sales of sugar, flour, matches, and canned goods. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Notes of complaints, missing deliveries, and neighbors who hadn't returned from errands. Some entries were hurried, almost frantic, referencing shadows at the edge of town, people vanishing, and the inability to find any trace of them. My pulse quickened. Even decades later, the words spoke directly to me, bridging the distance of years with a sense of fear and helplessness. The store itself seemed to respond to my attention. The air grew heavier, thickening around me as I read. Shadows stretched longer than they should, corners of the room darkening despite the beam of my flashlight. I shook my head, trying to maintain reason. Old buildings leaned oddly, warping with age, playing tricks on the mind. But the arrangement of the shelves, the ledger left open, and the faintly touched surfaces suggested otherwise. Someone had been here, or perhaps something. I wandered down the narrow aisles, taking in the strange precision of the display. A jar tipped slightly forward on one shelf. A stack of tins perfectly aligned. A basket of cracked potatoes positioned as if waiting to be taken. It made no sense. No one could have cared for this store in decades, yet the scene was almost too deliberate, too neat to be entirely abandoned. My flashlight flickered and I blinked rapidly, trying to force clarity. Was it my imagination, or was there a presence, subtle, patient, moving just beyond the edges of my vision? I found more letters tucked between the shelves, brittle envelopes yellowed with age. Opening one, I saw a note addressed to a woman who had lived in Cedar Creek, referencing deliveries that had never arrived and neighbors who had disappeared mysteriously. Another letter contained a simple request: please check on them. They have not been seen for weeks. The handwriting trembled slightly, a hint of desperation preserved in ink. I traced the words with my finger, feeling an odd connection across time, as if the writer's fear and urgency had seeped into the paper, lingering long after they were gone. I paused near a display of household items, soap, small tools, and cooking utensils, all meticulously arranged. The light caught something at the edge of the shelf, and I saw a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath a jar. I picked it up carefully. It was a list, names of townsfolk, some I recognized from the diary I had found earlier, others new. Next to each name were notes, short and cryptic. Late at night, gone before dawn, never returned. My chest tightened. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, the ink still legible despite decades of age. It made the store feel less like a ruin and more like a repository of memory, holding traces of lives snatched away and recorded carefully, almost obsessively. I moved toward the back, where a small staircase led to what had once been a storage loft. The stairs groaned under my weight, dust falling in clouds around me. The loft itself was cramped, filled with boxes and crates, some opened, others intact. I ran my hand along a crate's edge, noticing faint scratches along the wood. I froze, listening. The store was silent, yet I could feel it. The pressure of unseen eyes, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of air that suggested movement just beyond the reach of my senses. I picked up an old tin from one of the crates, inspecting it. The label had long faded, but the contents, some kind of dried food, were intact. It was as though the store had been frozen in time, paused at the moment of abandonment, yet alive in some subtle, hidden way. My flashlight flickered again, briefly plunging the room into darkness before returning. In that fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the loft, indistinct and shadowed, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. My heart thumped. I told myself it was nothing, shadows, tricks of light, but the unease remained, knotting tightly in my chest. Descending slowly, I noticed that the layout of the store made the shadows seem to lean toward me, converging in corners, pooling beneath shelves. I could hear my own breathing echo faintly in the silence, each exhale sounding unnaturally loud. The letters and lists, the organized objects, the fleeting shapes at the edge of vision, they all combined to create a sense of deliberate presence. Someone or something had been here, watching, arranging, waiting. The realization pressed heavily, a subtle dread that crawled beneath my skin and into my mind. I approached the front door, pausing to glance once more down the aisles. The objects were perfectly still, yet the feeling of being observed remained, lingering in the air like a faint perfume. Outside, the street was empty, the sun nearly gone, leaving only the dim glow of twilight. I stepped out, letting the door close slowly behind me, listening to the hollow echo of its final creak. The world outside the store felt different, darker, more uncertain, as though the building itself had left a mark on me. Walking back toward the main street, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Old houses, a decrepit store, abandoned letters and diaries, all signs of a town long left behind. And yet, the sense of deliberate organization, the subtle signs of recent handling, the fleeting shapes at the edge of vision, all suggested otherwise. Cedar Creek was not merely abandoned. Its memory lingered in the air, in the wood and paper, in the shadowed corners where light never fully reached. As I moved further into the evening, I glanced back at the store one last time. Its windows were dark, but in the faint glow of twilight, I could swear I saw the shelves, the jars, and the letters shift ever so slightly, as if acknowledging my presence, or perhaps warning me to tread carefully. I felt the weight of the town pressing around me, its history heavy with absence and mystery. And I knew, even as I walked away, that the old general store had left a mark on me, a lingering whisper of presence that would not fade with time. The sun had fully slipped behind the horizon when I left the general store, and the town of Cedar Creek was swallowed in a deep, almost unnatural darkness. The last traces of twilight clung to the tops of the trees, brushing the rooftops with faint silver light, but the streets themselves were black, empty, and expectant. The overgrown weeds along the sidewalks swayed in a breeze I could barely feel, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. Every step I took seemed louder than it should, the sound echoing off crumbling walls and broken fences. I walked slowly, flashlight cutting a narrow path before me, revealing homes in various states of decay. Some were collapsed, others surprisingly intact. But no matter the condition, each seemed to lean toward the street, windows dark and hollow like eyes following my progress. I felt a weight in the air, a pressure that pressed against my chest and made each breath heavier. I had expected quiet, absolute silence, but the town had other plans. It hummed with memory, with something that seemed almost alive. The first glimpse came without warning. A figure, distant and indistinct, appeared at the far end of the street. I froze instantly. It was human-shaped, tall, thin, standing still as if watching me. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as I focused on the figure, trying to make sense of what I saw. But the instant I stepped closer, it vanished, gone without a sound or trace. I blinked, heart hammering, telling myself it was a trick of the shadows, a reflection in a broken window, anything but reality. Yet a shiver ran down my spine, a warning I could not ignore. I pressed on, each step measured, my mind racing with possibilities. Another figure appeared farther down the street, fleeting, just a silhouette against the decaying buildings. I tried to call out to ask if anyone was there, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure vanished as soon as I took a step toward it, leaving me alone again, yet somehow aware that I was being observed. It was not just the occasional glimpse of shadow, but a persistent feeling, like eyes following me from the darkness, calculating, waiting. The houses themselves seemed complicit in the illusions. Windows reflected shapes that moved just beyond the edges of my vision. Shadows leaned in impossible angles, darkening suddenly when I approached. A broken porch light, hanging loosely from its wiring, flickered for a moment, and I thought I saw someone step into the doorway, only to find it empty when I arrived. My pulse quickened with every encounter, each one brief, fleeting, and more unsettling than the last. I turned down a narrower street, the buildings closing in, the overgrowth pressing against the edges of the road. Here, the darkness felt heavier, the air colder, carrying whispers I couldn't fully understand. It was not language as I knew it, but fragments, tones, syllables, the faintest echo of conversations, almost within reach of comprehension but always slipping away. The hair on my arm stood on end. I was no longer merely walking through a town. I was threading through a memory, through moments frozen, people vanished, a presence lingering long after life had left. A small group of figures appeared near a collapsed fence. They were closer than before, their movements almost human, yet distorted, unreal. I stopped abruptly, flashlight steadying in my grip. I called softly, my voice hesitant. "Hello, is anyone there?" Silence. The figures shifted slightly, just enough to suggest awareness, then dissolved into nothingness. The ground where they had stood was empty. My mind screamed for explanation, for rationality, but none came. I was alone, yet I was not. The feeling of being watched pressed harder, settling deep into my chest. I passed a house that had once been charming, its porch sagging but its windows still intact. Inside, I thought I saw someone moving, a woman perhaps, standing by the window, staring outward. I stepped closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure vanished as soon as I reached the threshold. I froze, listening. No footsteps, no movement, only the quiet rustle of wind through broken shutters. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if the darkness itself had weight. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to keep moving. The street curved, and I caught glimpses of movement at the corner, quick and fleeting, shadowed forms darting between buildings. I stopped, heart thumping, trying to focus. Shapes appeared and disappeared almost in rhythm with my steps. For a moment I questioned my own perception. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks after hours of solitude, but the encounters were too precise, too consistent, too deliberate. Cedar Creek was speaking through its shadows, reminding me that the missing had left traces, and those traces were still here. I noticed footprints in the dirt along the narrow side alley. They were faint but unmistakably human-sized, pressed into the ground recently. I crouched, studying them. They led down the alley toward a cluster of houses at the edge of town. I hesitated. Could someone truly be here, moving silently through a town long abandoned? Or was this another memory preserved in the earth itself, guiding me along a path I wasn't meant to follow? I followed the footprints cautiously, each step measured, each breath shallow. The whispers returned then, circling me, brushing my ears with words I could almost understand. "Go back, they watch, do not follow," my chest tightened. The sound was neither fully audible nor imagined. It was a pressure, a vibration against my skin and mind. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the path ahead, on the footprints, on the faint light of moon filtering through the trees. But the sense of being observed never left, growing heavier with each step I took. A small wooden fence blocked the entrance to a yard, its boards warped and broken. I climbed over carefully and found the remains of a garden, plants wild and unkempt, yet in some areas strangely tended. Among the overgrowth I saw movement again, a fleeting glimpse of a child, pale and still, disappearing behind the bushes. My heart raced. I whispered aloud, almost pleading, "Who's there? Please show yourself." Silence. Only silence, thick and suffocating, filled the air. I stepped forward and another figure appeared, adult-sized this time, at the edge of a broken porch. The figure was pale, indistinct, and seemed to flicker in and out of view. I wanted to call out, to reach for them, to understand. But the instant I moved closer, it vanished. The porch was empty, the boards warped and creaking under my weight. I felt a wave of vertigo, as if the world itself had shifted, and for a moment, I questioned whether I was moving through space or simply threading through the memory of it. The street widened slightly, leading to what had been the town square. Moonlight glinted off the cracked fountain, the basin dry and collecting shadows instead of water. I paused, looking around. Figures appeared along the edges of the square, tall, thin, fleeting glimpses. They were not threatening, not overtly human, but their presence carried an uncanny weight. I felt the sense of 1,000 eyes watching from the darkness, from the windows, from the empty streets themselves. Cedar Creek was alive in absence, and I was a guest unwelcome yet observed. I realized then that the night was a veil, separating the present from the memory, the living from the vanished. Each figure I glimpsed, each shadow that flickered, was a fragment of the town's history, a reminder of those who had disappeared without explanation. And though I could not touch them, could not speak to them, I felt their awareness, their presence pressing against the edges of my mind. I was being watched, and perhaps guided, through a town that refused to let go. I moved toward the far edge of the square, heart heavy, senses heightened. Shapes appeared and vanished at the periphery, almost playful in their elusiveness, teasing my perception. The whispers returned, soft, almost melodic, threading through the wind. "Remember, do not forget they wait," I shivered, realizing that Cedar Creek had its own way of speaking, of holding memory, of keeping the absent present in ways that defied logic. The night deepened further, shadows pooling in corners, stretching across the cracked roads, merging with the overgrowth. I kept walking, deliberately slow, trying to steady my racing pulse. Every sound, every movement, every fleeting figure left me on edge, and yet I could not turn away. Cedar Creek demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement of its vanished souls, of the history etched into its streets and homes. I finally paused near an old fence at the edge of town. Figures appeared again, distant and flickering, watching silently. I could not see them clearly, but I could feel them, the weight of eyes that were not entirely human and yet not entirely imagined. I whispered to myself, trying to ground my thoughts. It's the memory, it's the town, nothing else. But even as I said it, I knew the town held more than memory. It held presence, lingering, patient, unyielding. And I, for better or worse, was now part of it. I arrived at the edge of Railton just as the last rays of sun were fading, casting the landscape in shades of gray and muted orange. The road ended abruptly at a rusted iron gate, half fallen and tangled in wild vines. Beyond it lay the old train station, a structure long abandoned, its wooden planks warped, paint peeling in jagged strips, and windows darkened with decades of grime. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot, and felt the first stirrings of unease. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint creak of an old sign swaying in the evening breeze. The station platform stretched before me, cracked and uneven, weeds forcing their way through the concrete, their green shoots stubborn against time. I ran my hand along the edge of the railing, feeling the rust bite lightly at my skin. Every touch seemed to echo in the stillness, a reminder of the emptiness that had settled over this place long ago. Signs hung crookedly from the roof, remnants of schedules and destinations that had not seen a passenger in decades. The lettering was faded, almost illegible, but I traced the names with my eyes, imagining the bustle that must have once filled this now silent station. I stepped onto the platform, my boots crunching softly against gravel and loose stones. The tracks stretched ahead, disappearing into the shadows of overgrown trees and fog that had begun to roll in. I could almost hear the ghost of a train whistle, faint and distant, as if the wind carried echoes of the past. The station itself seemed aware of my presence, the wooden beams creaking softly under their own age, responding to each step I took. I felt the weight of memory pressing down, heavy and tangible, like the space itself remembered every arrival, every departure, and every soul that had passed through. Inside the station, the air was colder, damp, and heavy, carrying the faint scent of rust, mildew, and old wood. I ran my hand along the counter, knotting the layers of dust disturbed in a pattern that suggested someone, or something, had been here recently. Leaflets, old tickets, and ledgers lay scattered, some neatly stacked, others tipped over as if hastily abandoned. I picked up a schedule, yellowed and brittle, listing trains that no longer ran, times that had no meaning in the present, destinations that seemed to exist only in memory. My fingers traced the faded ink, and I could almost feel the pulse of past travelers, their anticipation and routine, now long gone. I moved slowly through the station, flashlight illuminating the walls and corners. Posters advertising excursions and seasonal trips hung in tatters, curling away from the wood like the edges of a forgotten dream. A small waiting room sat silent, benches coated in dust, a broken clock frozen at an hour decades in the past. On one of the benches lay a suitcase, battered and partially open, its contents a mix of clothes yellowed with age and a small, cracked photograph of a family I would never know. I picked it up, holding it lightly. There was a story here, lives interrupted, journeys left incomplete, and the silence around me made it feel alive, as if the building itself mourned the absence of those it had once served. I glanced toward the ticket office. Its window was cracked, the glass jagged, yet the interior was uncannily intact. Behind the counter, ledgers lay stacked with neat precision, pencils still tucked in holders, stamps pressed lightly into ink pads. Everything was arranged, almost deliberately, as if someone had just stepped away. I leaned closer to inspect a ledger and found entries written in precise, deliberate handwriting. Ticket sales from decades past were recorded meticulously, but in the later pages, there were notes that unsettled me. Mentions of travelers who never reached their destinations, reports of goods missing from freight, and vague entries that suggested confusion or concern among the station staff. The final pages were left blank, except for a single scribbled note. They never came back. A sudden shift in the air made me pause. The room felt heavier and a faint creak echoed from somewhere above. I held my breath, listening. Perhaps it was just the building settling, decades of wood shifting under its own weight. Yet the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. I traced the stairs leading to what had once been a small office loft, each step creaking beneath my careful weight. The loft was dark and narrow, filled with old ledgers, boxes of tickets, and envelopes containing records I could barely make sense of. Dust swirled in the flashlight beam, catching the air in a haze that made the space seem alive, almost breathing. Among the boxes, I found a series of letters, carefully folded and preserved despite the years. They were correspondence between the station master and distant family members or colleagues, mundane at first. Inquiries about shipments, confirmations of arrivals, casual mentions of family events. But gradually, the tone shifted. References to travelers disappearing during night trains, to cargo unaccounted for, to strange figures seen walking along the tracks in the fog. The writing became tense, anxious, almost desperate in the final letters. One line lingered in my mind. Something waits along the rails, unseen but aware. I stepped back from the desk, breathing shallowly, feeling the weight of the place settle on me. The air carried a faint vibration, the kind you notice rather than hear, as if the walls themselves were remembering, recalling events too long past to fade. The station was not just abandoned, it was holding on, preserving, waiting. Each sound, each creak, each shadow seemed deliberate, as though the building had awareness beyond its structure, a consciousness shaped by decades of departures, absences, and the sudden vanishings noted in the ledgers and letters. I moved toward the main platform again, scanning the tracks as twilight deepened into night. The rails stretched forward into shadow, and I imagined the long trains that had once roared through this place, carrying passengers who were now ghosts in memory. A faint rustle reached my ears, soft but distinct like footsteps along the gravel. I froze, flashlight sweeping in slow arcs. Nothing, just the shadows stretching and shifting in the moonlight. I told myself it was the wind, the old building settling, my imagination running wild in the silence. Yet the unease persisted, knotting tightly in my chest. A bench near the edge of the platform held a small suitcase, its clasp broken and contents spilling slightly onto the floor. I knelt, examining a journal tucked inside. The pages were yellowed, edges curling, but the writing was legible. The author had been a passenger, documenting their journey and observations of the town and the station. At first, the entries were light-hearted, describing stops along the rails and minor adventures. But soon the entries grew darker, noting trains that were late or vanished entirely, conductors who avoided certain stops, and passengers who seemed uneasy without explanation. The last entry was abrupt. "I do not trust the station. Something waits." The night air pressed in, cold and heavy, and I realized how deep into the darkness I had wandered. I stood slowly, scanning the platform again, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw movement, a shadow flitting along the tracks just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My pulse quickened. I called out softly, voice barely above a whisper. Nothing responded. The shadow did not move again, and yet the memory of it lingered, a ghost of motion in a place that had no life. I stepped to the edge of the platform, letting my gaze travel down the tracks. They seemed endless in the dim light, cutting through the overgrowth and mist that now rose from the surrounding fields. I felt the weight of the absent passengers, of forgotten schedules, of letters and ledgers left behind. Railton was not merely empty. It was haunted by its own history, preserved in wood, metal, and paper, each element holding the imprint of lives interrupted, journeys left unfinished. I lingered there for a long time, breathing the cold air, listening to the silence, trying to reconcile the stillness with the sense of motion I felt in the shadows. The station had a rhythm, subtle and slow, like a heartbeat buried beneath decades of abandonment. I could almost follow it, feel it guiding me through memory, history, and absence. And though I knew I was alone, the feeling of being observed, of the station remembering me, pressed against me with quiet insistence. Finally, I turned back toward the car, casting one last glance at the platform. The sign swayed in the breeze, creaking softly, the windows starring like hollow eyes. I felt a chill that was not entirely from the cold. The abandoned station held more than dust and rust. It held memory, awareness, and the faint echo of those who had vanished along the tracks. And as I walked away, the weight of it lingered, pressing at the edges of my mind, whispering faintly with every step, "Remember us, do not forget." The tracks stretched ahead, disappearing into a thickening fog that rose from the overgrown fields. I paused at the edge of the platform, staring down the steel rails that gleamed faintly under the pale moonlight. My flashlight cut a narrow path along the ties, illuminating moss, twisted weeds, and scattered debris. The air was heavier here, damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I knew I couldn't stay on the platform forever. Something had drawn me forward, a curiosity I could not resist despite the gnawing sense of unease. I stepped onto the ties carefully, each footfall causing the rusted metal to groan faintly beneath my weight. The fog swallowed the world around me, and the trees along the tracks appeared like dark silhouettes, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. The silence was complete, except for the occasional crack of a distant branch, snapping under some unseen weight. I shivered and pressed onward, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The fog seemed alive, moving with me, closing in as I advanced into the unknown. Soon I began to notice signs that someone or something had been here recently. The first clue was a scorch mark on one of the wooden ties, blackened and cracked, as if fire had been applied with intent. I bent to examine it, the smell of burnt wood still faint in the air. It wasn't old. The edges of the char were darker than the surrounding decay, suggesting recent exposure. My pulse quickened. Fires weren't common here, not for decades. Who or what had left this mark, and why? A few steps farther, I saw scattered remnants of luggage, broken and overturned along the edge of the tracks. A suitcase lay split open, its contents spilling into the dirt, clothes faded and torn, a photograph cracked and soil-stained, a small comb still intact. I knelt to inspect the items, feeling the weight of absence pressing against me. The suitcase's handle was scorched like the ties, and the edges of the photograph carried a faint, dark stain that made my stomach twist. Old blood. I could not say whose or how old, but the evidence was undeniable. Someone had suffered here, violently, and the tracks had carried the remnants into the wilderness. I shined my flashlight along the fog-shrouded rails, the beam cutting through the mist in thin, trembling arcs. More signs emerged. A torn jacket snagged on a branch, a single shoe half buried in mud, a hat pressed flat against the ground. Each piece seemed deliberate, scattered as if to tell a story or perhaps to warn. The pattern was chaotic yet purposeful, guiding me deeper into the wilderness, toward a conclusion I did not want to reach. The fog pressed in closer, muffling the sounds of my steps and amplifying the whispers of the wind, which now seemed almost articulate. The woods closed around me, trees arching overhead and forming a tunnel of darkness. I noticed scorch marks on nearby trees, blackened bark curling like the edges of old paper. Something had burned here recently, violently. The scattered luggage and personal items were interspersed with these marks, as if a struggle had taken place along this very stretch of rail. I swallowed hard, gripping my flashlight tighter and pressed forward, careful to avoid disturbing the evidence. My mind raced with questions. Who had been here? Who had suffered? And why had the tracks been abandoned, leaving only these haunting traces behind? A torn photograph caught my attention, half buried in the mud. I bent down, brushing away the dirt, and froze. It was a group of people, a family perhaps, smiling at the camera. Their faces were familiar from the station ledger, the letters I had seen. My stomach lurched as I realized these were the same names noted as missing, the same souls who had vanished decades ago. The photograph was torn in half, the edges jagged, and a dark stain marred one corner. The weight of it pressed down on me, the realization that the violence here had not been random, that the stories I had read were grounded in something real, something lingering in this very soil. I pressed onward, following the tracks as the fog thickened. Shadows danced just beyond the flashlight's reach, teasing me with fleeting glimpses of movement. At first, I thought they were animals, raccoons or deer, but the shapes were wrong, too deliberate, almost human in posture. I shook my head, trying to maintain reason. The mind plays tricks in darkness, I told myself. Yet the unease remained, crawling under my skin, whispering that I was not entirely alone. That the tracks themselves were alive with memory, with echoes of those who had been left behind. Further along, I found more personal effects. A child's mitten frayed at the edges, a scarf snagged on a thorn bush, a small leather-bound notebook cracked open on the ground. I picked up the notebook, feeling the rough leather under my fingertips. The pages were water-stained, mud-smeared, yet the writing was legible. It was a diary written in small, neat letters. At first, mundane observations, the weather, meals eaten, small daily routines. But then the entries became darker, describing strangers on the tracks, odd sounds in the night, and the feeling of being followed. The final pages were chaotic, words scribbled in haste. They see us, we cannot escape, do not follow the tracks. My pulse raced. The diary was a direct echo of the lives disrupted along these rails. The scattered items, the scorched wood, the dark stains, they all pointed to a violent, deliberate act, carried out long ago but preserved in this wilderness, frozen in the fog and the memory of the tracks. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts, but the oppressive silence around me made it impossible. Every snapped twig, every shifting shadow, every faint whisper of wind felt loaded with intent. I pressed on, following the scattered evidence deeper into the woods. The tracks curved sharply, partially hidden by overgrowth, and I noticed footprints in the mud alongside the rails. They were fresh, or at least newer than the decades-old debris, human-sized, careful, deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. Nothing, save the muffled drip of water from leaves and the faint rustle of fog. Whoever had left these marks had gone ahead, and I was left to follow. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The wilderness here was thick, suffocating, and I could not shake the sensation of being watched. A flash of movement caught my eye far ahead, near a cluster of fallen trees. Something darted behind the trunks, quick and fleeting, and I blinked, trying to focus. The shape vanished instantly, leaving only the rustle of leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I whispered into the fog, my voice trembling, "Who's there? Show yourself." No answer came, only the heavy press of night and the echo of my own words. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to proceed, daring me to uncover more of its grim story. The tracks continued, winding deeper into darkness. I noticed scorch marks again, deeper and wider this time, like a small fire had raged here. Burnt pieces of clothing littered the ground, charred fabric, twisted metal from luggage, personal items destroyed by flame. The violence of it was impossible to ignore, yet the fog softened its horror, blurring edges and making the scene surreal. I could feel the echoes of struggle lingering, heavy in the cold night air, pressing against my mind with every step. At one point I paused, flashlight hovering over a cracked suitcase. The leather was scorched and stiff, the clasps bent and broken. Inside, a few personal items remained: a ring, a comb, a journal half torn. The journal contained hurried notes. "They came at night, no one saw, burned our tracks, we tried to hide, someone knows." I traced the words with my fingertips, shivering as the full weight of history settled over me. These were not just random acts of violence. There was intent, calculation, and a lingering presence that had refused to leave. Preserved in the scorched wood, the blood-stained items, and the fog that now hugged every surface. By the time I reached the farthest visible stretch of tracks, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The fog had grown thick, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The forest around me was alive with shadows and movement, or perhaps memory. I felt the pull of the tracks, a mixture of curiosity and dread urging me to continue. Yet the deeper I went, the heavier the weight of the vanished and the violence grew. Every scorch mark, every broken piece of luggage, every stain told a story, a warning, a record of lives violently interrupted and preserved in this wilderness. Finally, I stopped. The tracks ahead were lost entirely in fog and overgrowth, disappearing into an indistinct gray. I felt the full weight of the night pressing in, the evidence of violence all around me, and the awareness that I was not alone, that something lingered, patient and observant. The forest was quiet but alive in the ways that matter most: memory, presence, and intent. I swallowed hard, realizing that the tracks were more than a path. They were a history, preserved and waiting for those brave, or foolish, enough to follow them. I hesitated at the entrance of the abandoned rail car, a small, rusted boxcar left derelict along a side track that branched from the main line. The metal siding was pitted and corroded, and the doors hung on crooked hinges that groaned faintly when I touched them. I pushed one slowly, listening to the scraping of steel against rust and the whisper of air escaping the hollow car. Inside, the darkness was thick, almost tangible, and my flashlight cut a narrow swath across the interior, revealing the peeling paint, rotting floorboards, and the scattered debris of a life long gone. The air smelled of iron and decay, a cold, damp scent that settled deep in my lungs. My boots creaked on the wood, the sound loud in the stillness. I moved slowly, deliberately, scanning for anything that might offer insight into the stories I had begun to uncover along the tracks. There in the corner of the car, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, tucked beneath a splintered bench. I knelt and picked it up, holding it carefully, aware that even the slightest crumple might erase the fragile message it contained. The note was handwritten, the ink faded but legible. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical, yet the words carried a weight that made my pulse quicken. It read simply, "They will not leave the tracks. I cannot stop them. Remember what happened here. Nobody listens." My fingers trembled slightly as I held it. I had no idea who had written it or when, but the sense of urgency, of warning, was immediate. The note seemed to pulse with the fear of someone who had seen or experienced something terrible. I sat on the edge of the bench, flashlight resting on my knees, staring at the note and trying to steady my racing mind. The handwriting suggested calm, yet the words themselves were frantic. Whoever had written this had lived through something that could not be spoken aloud in ordinary terms. The tracks, the rail cars, the abandoned station, they were not merely empty. They were memory, and they carried with them the echoes of a violence that had been recorded, in fragments, by those who had survived long enough to write it down. I turned the paper over in my hands, searching for more, for a signature or date, but found nothing. It was deliberately anonymous, as if the author feared being discovered. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the implications. This note was a breadcrumb left by someone who had witnessed something dark, perhaps a murder that had never been solved, perhaps an event that had been buried intentionally. And now, decades later, it had resurfaced, in my hands, calling me deeper into the mystery. The railcar itself seemed to respond to my focus, the shadows shifting in the corners, edges blurring as if the light itself were reluctant to linger. I noticed marks along the floor, scuffs, scratches, and faint stains that had the hue of dried blood. Nothing fresh, of course, but old enough to speak of violence endured here. I traced one mark with my finger, the wood rough and uneven beneath my touch, and imagined the moments it had been made. A struggle, a fall, the desperation of someone trying to survive. The thought made my stomach tighten. A small metal latch on the side of the car caught my attention. It was partially open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the bench. My curiosity overcame caution. I slid the lid aside and found a collection of items: a pocket watch, a torn scarf, a small notebook filled with hurried, nearly illegible handwriting. Each object had the same air of urgency, of lives interrupted suddenly and violently. The notebook contained entries that were harder to decipher than the note I had found, but one line jumped out at me. I saw them take her onto the tracks. Nobody will believe me. I am alone in this. I swallowed hard. The entry confirmed what I had feared. The note was more than a warning. It was evidence of a crime, a murder perhaps, carried out along the rails. And the handwriting, the care, the fear, the isolation, made it clear that whoever had written it had felt powerless, trapped, and desperate. I could feel that fear in the air, almost physically, pressing against my chest as I sat there, staring at the pages, trying to comprehend the horror that had been inflicted in this small, overlooked corner of the world. I held the note and notebook together, studying them, aware that each word was a fragment of a story I might never fully understand. The railcar felt alive with memory, each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the rusted metal, a whisper from the past. I imagined the scene, the struggle, the scream swallowed by the night, the deliberate concealment of evidence, the way the tracks had hidden secrets under fog and time. I felt the weight of the vanished, their presence almost tangible in the cold, still air. A sudden sound made me jump, a faint scrape, like metal dragged along wood. Coming from the far end of the car, I held my breath, flashlight sweeping slowly in its direction. Nothing, just shadows and the occasional flicker of dust in the beam. My pulse raced, and I told myself it was nothing but the old car settling, responding to the weight of decades. Yet the hairs on my neck stood up, and I felt the undeniable sense that I was not entirely alone. The railcar had preserved more than notes and objects. It had preserved awareness, the lingering imprint of fear and violence. I placed the items back carefully, as if returning them to their proper place in a narrative I was only beginning to understand. The note, the notebook, the personal belongings, they were all part of a story that had been left for someone to discover, to remember, to witness. And now, in the silence of the abandoned railcar, I was that witness. I felt the gravity of responsibility pressing against me. To leave the station without acknowledging what had happened here would be to turn my back on lives interrupted, stories abandoned, and justice left unspoken. As I stepped back toward the door, I paused once more, glancing at the note lying on the bench. Its words seemed to breathe in the dim light. They will not leave the tracks, remember what happened here. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The message was not merely a warning. It was a call, an invitation, or perhaps a demand, to follow the story, to trace the violence, to bear witness. And I realized that the path I had begun walking along the abandoned tracks was no longer simply exploration. It was participation. Outside the rail car, the fog had thickened, curling around the tracks like restless tendrils. The trees loomed on either side, dark and silent, and the tracks disappeared into shadow. I clutched the note in my hand, weighing my next move. The wilderness beyond the car was dense, oppressive, and yet the evidence, the message, and the sense of unfinished history called me onward. I knew that following it would lead me deeper into the darkness, both of the forest and of human actions long buried. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the ties again, flashlight casting narrow beams into the fog. The note burned lightly in my pocket, its message clear, insistent. Someone had been killed here. Someone's life had ended violently along these tracks, and the world had looked away. I would not. The path ahead was uncertain, the night heavy with memory and the woods silent, but the call of truth, or perhaps obsession, drew me onward. I could feel the pulse of the past guiding me, whispering through the fog, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, I could not turn back. The first step onto the tracks beyond the railcar felt heavier than it should have. Each tie groaned under my weight, each stone crunching underfoot in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. I could sense that I was being watched, not by a living eye, but by the residue of life and death embedded along this path. The fog swirled, carrying faint impressions of sound, of movement, of memory. And in that quiet, I understood fully. The tracks themselves would reveal the truth, but only to those who dared follow them to the end. I had been walking along the fog-draped tracks for what felt like hours, though the world offered no way to measure time. The air was thick with moisture, clinging to my skin and carrying the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the forest and the tracks themselves were weighing on me, pressing me into the history embedded in the soil. My flashlight cut narrow arcs through the fog, illuminating occasional scorch marks on ties, scattered remnants of luggage, and twisted branches that clawed at the edge of my path. Then I heard it, a long, low whistle echoing in the distance. At first I thought it was the wind, shaping itself into sound between the trees, carrying the faint, mournful pitch of memory. But it came again, deliberate this time, stretched and haunting, lingering just long enough for the chill in my chest to deepen. The whistle carried with it the weight of empty cars, of passengers long gone, of journeys that had ended abruptly. My steps faltered. The tracks before me seemed to stretch further, yet somehow closer at the same time, drawn forward by the invisible hand of that sound. I stopped, straining to locate its source. The whistle did not appear to come from anywhere real. There were no engines, no movement, only the faint vibration in the fog, vibrating through the air, through the rails, through me. My fingers tightened around my flashlight, knuckles white, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I told myself it was my imagination, the mind playing tricks after hours of wandering through decay and history. Yet the sound persisted, clear, mournful, and impossible to ignore. I moved cautiously forward, trying to follow the sound, though I had no hope of actually finding its source. Every step seemed amplified in the silence, the beam of my flashlight cutting fleeting arcs across the fog. Shadows swirled at the edge of perception, forming shapes that vanished when I tried to focus. The whistle blew again, and this time it seemed closer, yet still impossibly far, teasing me, pulling me deeper into uncertainty. My chest tightened, and I realized with a shiver that I had no sense of where the tracks ended, or what lay beyond the bend in the fog. The forest around me seemed to lean in, the trees forming skeletal arches overhead, casting distorted shadows in the flashlight's beam. Each rustle of leaves sounded like movement beside me, though nothing appeared when I turned. My mind conjured half-seen figures, passengers frozen in moments of terror or desperation, their faces pale and silent, their eyes watching from a memory I could not touch. The whistle carried on, a ghostly train cutting through the night, unseen but insistent. I paused again, listening. The echo lingered in my ears, vibrating through the fog, vibrating through my chest. It was a sound of departure and loss, of lives interrupted and journeys unfinished. I thought back to the note I had found in the abandoned rail car, to the diary entries, to the scorched luggage and scattered belongings along the tracks. All of it seemed to converge in that sound, a voice from the past reaching out to the present. It was neither friendly nor hostile, only insistent, a reminder that the tracks held more than wood, metal, and dirt. They held memory, preserved and patient. I pressed onward, flashlight in hand, ears straining for any indication of reality versus echo. The tracks curved slightly ahead, swallowed by the fog, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. There was a subtle vibration in the ground, a hum almost beneath perception, like the resonance of something enormous and distant, something not meant to be measured in ordinary ways. The whistle sounded again, closer now, higher in pitch, carrying a plaintive sorrow that made my chest ache. I could feel its pull, as if it were drawing me forward, testing my willingness to step beyond the threshold of the known. Shadows moved at the edges of the fog, shapes that were human but not fully formed, flickers that vanished when I tried to focus. I reminded myself repeatedly, nothing alive was here, only memory, only the residue of events long past. And yet the forest seemed to thrum with life, or perhaps with recollection, pressing against me, murmuring, whispering, insisting that I notice, that I remember. Each step brought new pieces of evidence, small remnants of lives interrupted. A scarf caught on a branch, a single shoe resting among roots, a torn photograph half buried in mud. They were arranged like breadcrumbs, leading me along a path I could not fully understand. I came to a small clearing along the tracks where the fog thinned slightly, revealing a rail signal, bent and rusted, leaning precariously as if frozen in motion. The whistle came again, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the signal, or perhaps from beyond it, somewhere further along the tracks that vanished into shadow. The sound's origin was impossible to determine, yet it carried with it an undeniable sense of purpose, as though it were calling specifically to me. I shivered, the hairs on my arms standing on end, and I felt both drawn and repelled. Aware that each step deeper was also a step toward uncertainty, I might not survive intact. The whistle sounded once more, elongated and mournful, echoing across the fog-draped forest. I paused and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound fill my senses. It was neither malevolent nor comforting, only insistent, like a question with no answer. A part of me wanted to run, to return to the station, to abandon the mystery entirely. Yet another part, stubborn and curious, urged me onward. I opened my eyes and continued along the tracks, flashlight sweeping. Ears straining, heart pounding in measured trepidation. I noticed movement in the fog again, faint silhouettes flitting just beyond the beam. My breath caught. Could it be another traveler, a living person following the tracks? I called out softly, voice trembling in the cold night air. "Hello!" Only the echo of my own voice returned, carried away by the mist. The silhouettes disappeared as I tried to focus, leaving only the oppressive quiet and the haunting whistle. It was impossible to discern whether I was being observed or simply imagining it, and that uncertainty pressed down on me with a weight all its own. The whistle seemed to change, elongating, stretching into notes I had never heard, mournful and discordant, vibrating through my chest and the wooden ties beneath my feet. I realized with a start that it was not just sound. It was memory, encoded in vibration and echo, preserved along the tracks, ready to confront anyone who dared walk them at night. The past was not gone. It waited, patient, insistent, drawing me along a path I could neither see nor fully understand. A sudden snap of a branch nearby made me jump. I swung the flashlight in its direction, but nothing was there. My pulse raced. The fog itself seemed to thicken, swallowing the light and shaping shadows that danced at the edge of perception. I felt as if the world had narrowed to the sound of the whistle and the path ahead, each step along the ties a negotiation with fear, memory, and the unknown. I could almost imagine the long trains that had once traveled these rails, carrying passengers into lives they would never finish. Now, all that remained was the echo, preserved and patient, calling out to anyone who would listen. I pressed on, following the sound as best I could. It pulled me deeper into the fog, around bends where the tracks disappeared entirely from view. Each whistle was a note in a song I did not know, a rhythm of absence and presence, guiding me through darkness and uncertainty. I thought of the missing passengers, the diaries, the notes, the scorch marks, and the scattered personal items. They were all part of the same story, a record of lives disrupted. And now the whistle added itself as another layer, another voice in a chorus of memory and warning. Finally, I came to a spot where the tracks vanished into a low, mist-filled depression in the ground. The whistle sounded one last time, long and mournful, vibrating in my chest and ears. I stopped, flashlight hovering over the fog, and realized I had no idea where the tracks ended, no sense of what was real and what was echo. My heartbeat slowed, tentative, as I considered retreat, yet the notes and journals I had discovered earlier reminded me of the unfinished story. Some part of me knew that I could not turn away, that the path I had chosen demanded I bear witness to what remained here, unseen and unresolved. I stood there for a long time, listening to the fog, the whistle fading into the distance, leaving only the thick, suffocating silence of the forest. Every sound was amplified, the drip of water from leaves, the rustle of a branch, the soft murmur of fog against the ground. And yet within that silence, the tracks spoke, carrying memory, warning, and unresolved violence. I felt the weight of it pressing against me, a slow, insistent gravity that left me aware that nothing in this place was ever truly gone. The fog rolled in thick from the ocean, swallowing the cliffs in a gray-white haze that made it hard to tell where land ended and water began. I drove slowly along the crumbling coastal road, tires crunching on loose gravel, each bend revealing only more mist and shadow. In the distance, I could just make out the outline of the lighthouse, a solitary tower leaning slightly, its white paint peeling, metal railings rusted from years of salt and wind. It seemed to rise directly from the fog, a sentinel watching over nothing and everything at once. I parked at the edge of the cliff, the ocean's roar muffled beneath the weight of the mist. My breath hung in the air in clouds, mingling with the salty tang that clung to every surface. I stepped out, feeling the chill of early evening seep through my jacket. The lighthouse loomed closer with each step, silent, imposing, and entirely alone. Except it wasn't. There was a sense, unplaceable and subtle, that I was being watched. The fog seemed thicker here, moving almost as if it had consciousness, curling around my feet, whispering with a sound I could almost, but not entirely, recognize as a voice. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, warped by years of neglect. I hesitated, hand on the weathered wood, listening. The air inside smelled of damp stone, mildew, and something I couldn't identify, something faintly metallic, faintly like blood, though I knew it was likely just rust and decay. I pushed the door gently, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. Darkness enveloped me immediately, though the fog still seeped through the cracks, casting the room in an eerie, shifting light. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each sound magnified in the hollow space, echoing up the spiral staircase that wound around the interior of the tower. I paused, eyes adjusting to the gloom. The room was sparse, as if the keeper had left in a hurry or had simply vanished. An old chair sat against the wall, faded and splintered. A desk lay in disarray, papers yellowed and curling. A lantern rested on a shelf, coated in dust. I moved slowly among these remnants, careful not to disturb them too much. Each item seemed to hum with memory, carrying the weight of routine, solitude, and perhaps the final, unspoken terror of the keeper's last days. I picked up one of the papers from the desk, a journal, its cover cracked, pages brittle. The writing was tight and deliberate, mostly mundane entries. The weather, the tides, notes about ships passing the point. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Lines became hurried, uneven. Fog is thicker than usual. The sea carries whispers. At night, I hear them walking along the cliffs, though no one is there. I fear the light may not be enough. My fingers trembled slightly. Whispers, footsteps. This was no longer the idle musings of a lonely man. There was fear here, palpable, tangible, lingering decades after the ink had dried. I set the journal down, feeling the weight of the keeper's presence in the empty room. I could imagine him packing the floor, lantern in hand, scanning the cliffs and waves for something that might never appear. Sometimes I thought I could hear the faint echo of his boots on the stairs, the sigh of his breath mingling with the constant wind. I swallowed hard, trying to remind myself that it was only imagination, that time and isolation could twist perception into shapes of terror. Yet the fog outside seemed to pulse, thick and restless, as though it were listening, waiting. I moved to the base of the spiral staircase and began to climb. Each step groaned under my weight, carrying sound upward and outward, scattering echoes that I imagined as footsteps behind me. The staircase wound tightly, and the light from my flashlight fell in narrow arcs along the stone walls, illuminating patches of mold, rust, and old rope left to decay. I tried to focus on the practical: steps, handrail, flashlight beam, but the unease was relentless. The fog outside pressed against the walls of the lighthouse, muffling the sound of the ocean, until the roar became a distant, dreamlike murmur. At the top, the lantern room came into view. Broken panes of glass allowed the fog to curl inside, swaying with the wind. The room smelled even more strongly of brine and rust, and the metal platform underfoot was slick with condensation. I stepped carefully to the edge, peering out into the fog. Nothing. Just the gray emptiness, the sense of space swallowed whole, and the faint echo of a whistle from the ocean breeze. Or was it memory? I could not tell. The light from the lighthouse, though long extinguished, seemed to linger in my mind, casting shadows on the mist as if the tower itself remembered the glow it once sent across the water. I circled the railing slowly, imagining the keeper standing here, scanning the horizon, marking the time, noting the passage of ships. I could feel his presence, a solitary man bound to duty and fear, and it made the air around me heavy. There was a silence in this room that pressed against thought, almost physical in its weight. And then I heard it, a soft, barely audible sound, almost a whisper carried on the wind. I froze. The fog outside swirled, and I could have sworn I glimpsed a shadow moving along the cliffs below. My heart quickened. No one was supposed to be here. No one at all. I knelt and examined the railing, the condensation cold against my skin. It occurred to me then that the keeper may have vanished without explanation, leaving nothing but the tower, the journals, and the fog to carry his story. What had happened to him? Did he leave, or had the ocean claimed him? Or had the cliffs themselves, silent, patient, eternal, taken some toll on a mind stretched thin by solitude? I shivered. The fog seemed to thicken even more, curling inside the lantern room as if drawn to me, pressing in like a living presence. I descended slowly, each step a careful negotiation with the creaking boards and the memories they carried. Back on the main floor, I wandered among the old furniture and papers again. The journal lay open where I had left it. The entries became even more frantic toward the end. They come at night. I hear voices over the waves. I light the lamp to keep them away. But the fog, oh, the fog, it hides more than it shows. I could almost hear his voice, soft, trembling, and utterly alone, calling through the years. Outside, the fog had shifted again, wrapping the lighthouse in a veil that made it nearly disappear from sight. I stepped onto the cliff's edge, careful of the loose stones beneath my boots, and stared out into the gray nothingness. The ocean was a dull, heaving mass, its motion smoothed by the mist. Somewhere beneath the surface, or perhaps just within the edges of perception, was the memory of the keeper, the echo of his fear, the imprint of lives lived in isolation and vigilance. The wind carried something faint, like a sigh, like a soft whistle, leaving me wondering if it had been real, or if the fog itself had learned to speak. I took one last look at the tower, leaning against the cliffs, and felt a sudden weight in my chest. Hollow Point had a history, one not written in newspapers or official records, but carried in journals, in memory, in fog that lingered longer than it should. The keeper's fate remained unknown, and perhaps that was how it was meant to be. The lighthouse, the cliffs, and the ocean together held the story, waiting for anyone willing to stand alone in the fog and listen. With a final shiver, I stepped back from the edge, the wind tugging at my jacket. The tower remained behind me, shrouded and silent, yet alive with memory, with absence, with lingering echoes that would not fade. I knew that somewhere in the fog, the keeper's story persisted, as vivid and as tragic as it had been decades ago, waiting for the next visitor to come and feel the weight of the past pressing through the mist. I returned to the lighthouse the next morning, though morning was a vague term in Hollow Point. The fog lingered like a stubborn memory, curling along the cliffs and hiding the ocean in a blanket of gray. The lighthouse seemed different under the pale, diffused light, less ominous, yet somehow still heavy with expectation. I carried the journal I had discovered the evening before, its pages fragile, edges curling from decades of damp air. Today, I intended to read it fully, to understand the life, and perhaps the unraveling, of the keeper who had tended this tower and vanished without a trace. The main room was cold and silent, the air thick with salt and dust. I laid the journal on the splintered desk and turned to the first entry, written in small, precise handwriting. The keeper had begun simply, noting the weather, the tides, and passing ships. But even in the first few pages, there was a tone I could not ignore, a subtle watchfulness, a hint of unease that grew with each sentence. It was the voice of a man attuned to the rhythms of the ocean, yet acutely aware of something else, something always just out of reach. As I read on, the journal began to reveal a life defined by routine and isolation. The keeper wrote of the lamp, of its nightly importance, of the weight of responsibility that fell on him alone. But then the entries shifted, the tone darkening, the words jagged with anxiety. The fog is different tonight. It moves, it watches. I hear things on the cliffs, though no one should be there. I must remain vigilant. They come in the night, I know they do. The capitalized, they struck me sharply. I could feel the tension in the ink, a paranoia that seemed to seep from the page itself. I ran my fingers over the paper, imagining the man hunched over his desk, lantern casting shadows on stone walls, scanning the cliffs as the wind moaned outside. I could almost hear the creak of his boots on the stairs, the sigh of his breath shallow and trembling. The entries became increasingly erratic. Lines were crossed out, rewritten, sometimes scrawled in a way that suggested fear, almost panic. Voices over the waves, whispers in the fog. I cannot let them see the light go out. If the light fails, they will take what I guard. I must guard it always. I paused and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to picture the cliffs, the sea, the keeper himself. The words conveyed urgency and obsession, but also a sense of ritual. He was not simply afraid of ships or the elements. He feared something unseen, something that moved with the fog and the tides. Perhaps he had imagined it. Perhaps the solitude had twisted his mind. Yet the weight of decades, preserved in ink and paper, suggested otherwise. There was a method to his madness, and I could feel the pull of it, as if the lighthouse itself wanted his story told. I continued reading, tracing the progression of his mind through months, maybe years of entries. He noted visitors, sometimes ships, sometimes shadows, always moving in ways that defied explanation. There were sketches of shapes in the fog, arrows indicating movement along the cliffs, notes about sounds carried across the waves. One entry stood out, the handwriting almost illegible, shaking with fear. They are watching from the water. I saw them last night. Dark shapes riding the waves, following me. The lamp must never die. If it goes out, the tide will take more than my life. I swear it. I felt a shiver crawl along my spine. The keeper had been alone, yes, but he had also been vigilant, attuned to every ripple of wind and wave. The fog, the cliffs, and the sea were not merely landscapes. They were participants in a story he could not escape. The journal seemed to pulse with his awareness, and as I read, I could almost feel the ocean itself pressing against the stone tower, the mist curling into the room as if carrying fragments of memory. Some entries hinted at darker deeds, though he never described them explicitly. He wrote of marking the passage, of guarding the boundary, of keeping intruders away. There was a repetition in the language, a ritualistic cadence that suggested obsession. I must keep the lamp burning. They must not come. I have kept them from the land, from the cliffs. I do what I must. The tide will not forgive a lapse. The words were unsettling, not because they described violence directly, but because they implied a history of it, a knowledge of consequences that the world outside would never understand. I lingered over one particularly cryptic passage. Last night I saw the reflection of the shapes in the water and they saw me. I do not think they meant harm, not yet, but the fog carries memory and memory carries obligation. If the light dies, I fear what the ocean remembers. I must act. I could feel the tension in the room, my own heartbeat quickening. The journal was more than documentation. It was a map of paranoia, obsession, and perhaps survival. The keeper had been alone in his vigilance, balancing on the edge of reason and terror, and the tower had absorbed every fear, every calculation. I paused and looked around the room, half expecting to see a shadow move along the walls. The lighthouse was silent, yet I felt it alive with history, every floorboard and railing carrying traces of the keeper's presence. The fog outside shifted, curling around the windows, and I thought I heard faint whispers carried on the wind, though perhaps it was only the ocean or my imagination. Still, the journal's words had set a rhythm in my mind, a cadence of fear that made me aware of every creak, every sigh of the building, every subtle movement of air. The entries grew more fragmented as I read further. Lines were cut short, phrases repeated, letters smudged with moisture. The shapes move with the fog. I have kept the lamp bright. They approach when I rest. I hear them in the wind. I do not sleep. I cannot. The tide remembers. I must remember too. There was a terrifying clarity in the repetition. He was obsessed, yes, but methodical, aware, and perhaps aware of something beyond ordinary perception. It was as if he had learned the language of the fog and the sea, and through it, he communicated warnings and rituals to keep something at bay. I turned a page carefully and found a small sketch, a rough map of the cliffs, the lighthouse, and the nearby shoreline. Notations indicated areas where they had been seen, where movement occurred, where sound carried. There were no names, no details about identity, only the geography of fear. I traced the lines with my finger, imagining the keeper packing, observing, recording, all while the wind shrieked against the stone and the ocean churned below. The meticulousness of it was haunting. He had devoted himself entirely to this task, consumed by vigilance and dread. A final set of entries drew my attention. The handwriting was almost illegible, scrawled with a trembling hand. I think I see them more clearly now. Not shadows, not shapes, but something else. They wait in the fog. The tide carries them, the wind calls them. If the lamp fails, all is lost. I hear voices beneath the waves. I cannot sleep. I cannot stop watching. The fear in these words was raw, human, palpable. I felt it seep into me as I read, a cold pressure on my chest, a reminder of what prolonged isolation and unseen threats could do to the mind. I closed the journal slowly, placing it on the desk, aware that the keeper's paranoia, obsession, and knowledge had lingered in this space long after he vanished. I could almost hear the rhythm of his nights, the endless watching, the silent calculations, the ritual of keeping the light burning. Outside, the fog shifted again, curling around the tower, pressing against the windows, carrying with it the ghost of vigilance, of fear, of memory. I stepped toward the door, reluctant to leave, knowing that the lighthouse had more stories yet to tell. I carried with me the weight of what I had read, the obsessive watchfulness, the hints of violence, the intimate fear of unseen presences. Hollow Point was not simply a place. It was a repository of memory, of terror, of lives lived on the edge of perception. The keeper's story lingered here, patient, insistent, pressing against the living as much as it had the dead. As I emerged onto the cliffs again, the fog thickened, swallowing the lighthouse behind me. I could see only the dim outline of the tower, leaning against the gray, silent ocean. The journal felt heavier in my backpack, not because of its weight, but because of the presence it carried. I knew that the keeper had vanished, but not entirely. His fear, his obsession, his vigilance, they remained embedded in the tower, in the fog, in the air itself. And I understood, suddenly, that Hollow Point would not release its secrets easily. I was not merely observing history. I was walking through it, guided by the memories of a man who had never truly left. That night the fog returned heavier than before, thick and pressing, curling into the cracks of the lighthouse like it had memory, like it had intention. I climbed the spiral staircase slowly, feeling the stone walls cold and damp under my fingertips, each step creaking beneath my boots. I carried a small lantern of my own, but even its warm glow seemed swallowed by the haze, absorbed into the gray weight that pressed against the tower from all sides. The keeper's journals were open on the desk below, reminders that vigilance here had never been optional. It had been survival. I reached the lantern room at the top, the place where the great lamp had once shone across the cliffs and out to sea. Now it was dark, the mechanism still and silent, the glass panes fogged with condensation. I lifted the cover and tried to ignite the lamp, the flame sputtering weakly before dying almost immediately. I tried again, and again. Each attempt was the same. The lamp seemed to resist, a stubborn, impossible refusal to give off even a single steady beam. A chill ran down my spine. I had read about old lighthouses failing occasionally, but this felt different, less mechanical, more deliberate, as if the lamp itself understood something I did not. I set my hands on the metal, cold and rough beneath my gloves, and wondered briefly if the fog outside had something to do with it. The night pressed against the tower like a living thing, whispering along the cliffs, and I imagined that I could hear faint footsteps, small creaks in the boards, echoes of someone moving in the shadows. Then I noticed them, marks on the walls. Faint at first, just smudges along the plaster near the stairwell window, but as I adjusted my lantern they became clearer. Strange scratches, almost deliberate, etched into the surface. Some looked like symbols, geometric and careful. Others were chaotic, jagged lines, as if someone, or something, had been moving along the walls in the night, leaving messages I could not yet understand. My heartbeat quickened. The fog outside seemed to swirl, twisting in ways I could not predict, and a cold breeze swept through the room despite the sealed windows. I ran my fingers over one of the marks. The plaster was damp beneath my touch, soft in places, worn as if it had been traced countless times. I could feel the rhythm in the scratches, the repetition, and a terrifying thought crept into my mind. The keeper had not been alone, not in the sense of company, but in the sense of presence. He had known or suspected. Something had come to him in the night, something that moved along the walls, something that did not belong to the living world. I took a step back, shining my lantern across the room, following the scratches up and down the walls. Each one seemed to tell a story, though it was a story I could not fully read. There was panic, obsession, a ritualistic attempt to communicate, perhaps to ward off or understand whatever had come to him. My pulse quickened as the wind howled through the broken panes, and I imagined the keeper packing in the darkness, lantern in hand, marking the walls with the same obsessive care. I tried the lamp again, coaxing it, holding it steady, whispering to it as if it were a living thing. The flame flickered weakly, then collapsed. I leaned close, pressing my forehead to the cool glass, staring out into the fog, trying to convince myself it was only age, only damp, only time. But the marks on the walls made it impossible. They carried memory. They carried warning. They carried presence. And now so did I. I stepped back and let my lantern swing gently with my movements. The scratches seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, like shadows flickering, like the fog outside reaching in to press against the walls. I could hear the ocean in a way I had not before, a low, vibrating hum beneath the roar of waves, almost like a heartbeat, like something vast and patient lying beneath the cliffs. I imagined the keeper hearing the same sound, night after night, aware that whatever moved in the fog had its own rhythm, its own purpose, and perhaps even intelligence. Sleep was impossible. I tried to sit in the corner of the lantern room, back against the wall, but every creak of the tower made my body tense. Every whisper of wind made me flinch. The scratches seemed to grow more vivid, more purposeful, as if they were feeding on my attention. I traced one with my finger, and it felt as if I could feel the hands that had made it, rough, desperate, trembling with fear and determination. The thought left a cold sensation crawling across my skin. I thought about the keeper, how long he had endured this isolation, this constant awareness of presence and absence, of the fog and the sea moving with a will of their own. And I realized that the lamp's refusal to ignite tonight was not just mechanical. It was symbolic, a continuation of his struggle, a reminder that some things in Hollow Point cannot be illuminated fully. They remain half-hidden, shifting, patient, waiting for the next witness to arrive. Hours pass, though I cannot say how many. Time was distorted, swallowed by the fog in the tower and the scratching walls. Every attempt to light the lamp ended in failure, and every glance toward the scratches made my stomach tight. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that pressed against my mind. Watch, mark, fear, survive, repeat. I wondered if the keeper had finally succumbed to exhaustion, to the impossibility of his task, or if he had vanished deliberately, leaving the tower and its secrets behind. I moved closer to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cliffs or the ocean. The fog was thick, curling and twisting, blotting out everything beyond the lighthouse. And yet in that grayness I thought I saw shapes, faint and fleeting, moving along the rocks below. My pulse hammered in my chest. I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize it, but the shapes were deliberate, almost purposeful, and my rational mind faltered. The fog pressed in, heavier now, like it was alive, like it carried memory and intent both. I stepped back from the window, letting my lantern light fall over the room. The scratches on the walls seemed to shimmer in the half-light, and I realized that my presence alone had disturbed something. The marks were not just records of the past. They were interactive, responsive. I felt the weight of unseen eyes, and I knew the keeper had felt it too. That tension, that awareness of being observed, of being part of something larger and incomprehensible, had dominated his life and now pressed against mine. I lingered in the lantern room until my legs ached and my chest burned with tension. I did not sleep. I could not. Every sound, the wind, the ocean, the faint creaks of the tower kept me alert. I imagined the keeper packing the floorboards, marking the walls, whispering to the fog and to the unseen visitors that came with it. I imagined the ocean keeping count of the lamp's failures, keeping score of lives devoted to vigilance and fear. When I finally descended the spiral staircase, the scratches on the walls seemed to fade into shadow, though I knew they remained, etched in plaster, etched in memory, waiting for the next person to notice. The fog outside pressed against the windows, curling in like smoke, and the sound of waves carried whispers I could not fully understand. I stepped out onto the cliffs once more, breathing the cold, salty air, feeling the weight of centuries in the mist. The lighthouse behind me leaned silently, its lamp refusing to shine, and I understood that some stories cannot be illuminated fully, some presences cannot be confronted directly, and some fears endure, patient and persistent, in the fog of Hollow Point. The fog outside had thickened into a dense, suffocating blanket that evening. I could barely make out the cliffs, and the ocean had become a muted roar, distant and distorted, as though I were listening through layers of gray. The lighthouse loomed above me, leaning stubbornly against the wind, every stone and railing etched with salt and memory. I hesitated at the bottom of the spiral staircase, taking a deep breath, trying to steady the feeling crawling up my spine, the same feeling that had settled over me the previous nights, that I was not alone. The staircase itself was narrow, steep, and worn, each step groaning under my weight. I ascended slowly, lantern in hand, casting light along the curved walls. The shadows stretched and bent unnaturally, as though the tower itself was alive, pressing against me from all sides. I told myself it was only my imagination, the echoes of my own movement bouncing off stone, but deep down I knew there was something different tonight, something deliberate, something waiting. It started as a faint sound, barely audible over the wind, a soft, scuffing noise from somewhere above me. I froze. My hand tightened on the railing. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, echoing in perfect rhythm with my own steps. I stopped completely. The staircase was narrow. There should be no one else, no second presence. And yet the sound continued, independent, yet eerily synchronized with my movement. I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize it. Old buildings creak. Wind shifts in strange ways. The spiral staircase amplifies every footstep. But even as I tried to convince myself, a chill crept over my skin. The steps above me were heavier, more deliberate, moving with intent, and they never faltered, never lagged, never changed. They were following me. I climbed higher, trying to keep my breathing steady. The lantern cast a golden circle of light that barely reached the wall ahead, leaving the shadows to twist and writhe around me. My mind kept circling back to the journals, to the keeper, to the obsessive vigilance that had consumed him. He had spent nights packing this very staircase, listening, counting, marking, and fearing what might be above him. Could this be what he feared? Could this, whatever moved on these steps, be what had haunted him so relentlessly? As I ascended, the steps beneath me groaned and shivered. I could feel the presence growing closer, pressing into my awareness like the fog itself. I tried to slow my pace, to listen more closely, to catch any hint of what followed. But the sound remained indistinct, impossible to place. There was a rhythm, yes, a certainty in each footfall, but no weight, no shadow, no figure appeared. And yet I could feel it, patient, deliberate, unmoving, yet always advancing. At one point I stopped entirely, leaning against the stone wall, trying to catch my breath. The lantern trembled in my hand, casting flickering light along the worn spiral. The footsteps continued, echoing somewhere above me, or maybe below, I could not tell. I realized then that the sound had no fixed location. It was omnipresent, impossible to locate, yet intimately close. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat gathered along my neck and back. I pressed on, each step deliberate, careful, my ears straining. The walls seemed to hum in response, carrying the echoes in ways that defied logic. There were moments when I thought the steps had paused, and the sudden silence was worse than the sound itself. It left me vulnerable, alert, imagining shapes behind me, around me, embedded in the very stone. The lighthouse had become a living entity, amplifying fear, magnifying uncertainty, turning routine motion into a test of nerve and will. Halfway up, I noticed scratches along the railing, fresh and jagged, the same kind I had seen etched into the walls below. My fingers brushed them lightly, and a shiver shot through me. Someone or something had been here recently. My pulse hammered in my chest. I thought of the keeper, packing, marking, watching, defending himself against presence and perception alike. Perhaps the scratches were a warning. Perhaps they were a message. Perhaps they were nothing at all. And yet they pressed into my mind with significance I could not deny. I continued upward, each step feeling heavier, the fog outside pressing against the lantern room windows like a living thing. And then I heard it clearly, a single, deliberate step directly above me. My chest tightened. It was not my step. I had paused long enough to distinguish the difference. And then another, followed by another, rhythmic, echoing, moving closer with each moment. I wanted to run, but the staircase curved too tightly for a quick escape, and the walls seemed to bend the light and sound, trapping me in a cocoon of suspense. My thoughts raced. The keeper had been obsessed with presence, with being watched, with the fog carrying whispers from the cliffs or the waves. I realized now that the staircase itself was a conduit, a pathway where the living and whatever lingered beyond perception could intersect. My imagination trembled, but so did something else, some primal awareness that told me I was being followed by intelligence, by something patient, deliberate, and unseen. I pressed my back against the wall for a moment, holding the lantern above my head, trying to see the staircase ahead. The steps spiraled upward endlessly in my sight, yet the sound persisted, echoing in impossible places. I could hear it on steps I had not yet reached, steps above, steps below, steps that should not exist. I wondered briefly if the keeper had experienced the same phenomenon, if his vigilance had led him to perceive the impossible, to sense the movement that could not be explained, to mark the walls in a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. I moved again, slowly, deliberately, every muscle coiled. The lantern trembled in my hand, casting light that seemed swallowed by the shadows. The footsteps never faltered, never paused, always following, always there. My breath came shallow, rapid, yet I could not stop, could not flee. The staircase had become a corridor of dread, each rotation amplifying the sense that the tower was alive, that the keeper had never truly left, that the fog carried memory and intention in equal measure. At one point I stopped entirely, leaning against the wall, listening. The steps above me paused. The silence was so complete it pressed against my eardrums. I held my breath. And then a single deliberate scrape against the stone, A sound that did not belong to any natural motion echoed downward. My skin prickled. I knew that the presence was aware of me, aware of my awareness. It was not hidden, it was not secret. It simply existed alongside me, patient, observant, waiting. I continued upward, each step a negotiation with fear itself. The staircase seemed endless, yet the lantern room grew nearer. The footsteps had stopped now, or perhaps they were merely shifting, moving around me in ways I could not comprehend. My ears strained, my heart raced. I realized then that the keeper had been right. There is something in this lighthouse, something that moves with the fog, with the stone, with the passage of time itself. It had followed him, and now it followed me. Reaching the top, I stepped into the lantern room, the fog curling inside the glass panes like smoke. The lamp, as before, refused to ignite, sputtering weakly before dying. I set my lantern down and pressed my hands against the cold metal railing, feeling the vibration of the ocean far below and the subtle, impossible presence around me. I could sense it, not with sight or hearing, but with a perception rooted deep in the chest and gut, a knowledge older than memory. The staircase had become a threshold, and I had crossed into the awareness the keeper had endured alone. The footsteps had vanished, or perhaps receded, leaving only the faint echo in the mind. I knew they were not gone. They were patient, deliberate, eternal. They would continue to follow anyone who entered, anyone who dared ascend the spiral staircase alone. I could feel the weight of history, of fear, of vigilance pressing into my bones. The keeper's obsession was no longer his alone. It was embedded in the tower, in the fog, in the very spiral of stone and iron that reached into the sky. I lingered at the top for a long time, breathing, listening, feeling the presence settle alongside me. The fog pressed against the windows, curling and twisting like smoke, hiding shapes, hiding intent. The ocean murmured below, its sound distorted and echoing, carrying whispers of the past. I realized then that the lighthouse, the keeper, and whatever followed him had become intertwined. The spiral staircase was no longer just a path upward. It was a conduit, a living thread connecting the past to the present, memory to perception, fear to awareness. When I finally descended, the steps groaning beneath me, the lantern swinging in my hand, I felt a strange connection to the keeper. I understood in some small way why he had marked the walls, why he had obsessed over the lamp, why he had vanished without a trace. The lighthouse demanded vigilance. It required awareness, and it carried its ghosts, its watchers, and its histories like fog pressing against the cliffs. The footsteps would continue, patient, deliberate, impossible. And now I knew they would follow me forever, too. I woke before dawn, as I often did, though sleep had been restless and shallow. The fog had thickened overnight, a gray tide that pressed into every crevice of the lighthouse. The world outside had become nothing more than shadows and mist, cliffs and ocean reduced to suggestion rather than substance. I carried my lantern down the spiral staircase slowly, as if hurrying might awaken something that otherwise remained dormant. Each step felt heavier than the last, though I could not say why. Perhaps it was the fatigue of nights spent in the tower, or perhaps it was the weight of awareness, of being watched by something patient and eternal. At the base of the staircase, I paused to look out the windows. The fog was almost complete now, swallowing the cliff edges, the waves, and the horizon in a pale, undulating gray. I thought of the journals of the keeper who had lived and vanished in this place, of the scratches etched into walls and rails, of the lamp that refused to shine, of footsteps on stairs that should not exist. I realized then that the lighthouse was not just a structure, not just stone and metal. It was a threshold. It had its own presence, its own will, and I had spent nights feeling its heartbeat echo alongside mine. I stepped outside onto the narrow ledge that circled the lighthouse, the wind strong and briny, tugging at my coat. My lantern cast a small circle of light onto the fog, which seemed to swallow it immediately. The cliffs below disappeared, the waves became whispers. The world had been reduced to nothing more than gray and silence. And yet there was a sense of anticipation, a tense expectancy, as if the fog itself was holding its breath, waiting. I moved slowly toward the edge, the ground wet and slippery beneath my boots. Each step carried me closer to the abyss of mist, and I realized that I had come here for a reason I did not fully understand. The keeper had vanished, yes, but perhaps he had not truly left. Perhaps the lighthouse had claimed him, folded him into its presence, and now it was claiming me too. The idea did not frighten me as it might have before. It was inevitable. I could feel it. Then, as I reached the cliff edge, the lighthouse itself began to blur. The fog shifted, rolling in waves, and the structure I had climbed, explored, and survived inside began to dissolve from view. First, the upper railing disappeared, then the walls, the lamp, the spiral staircase within. My lantern trembled in my hand, swinging slightly, but the fog did not move around it. It consumed it. I realized with a surreal clarity that the lighthouse was vanishing, not slowly or imperfectly, but entirely, as though it had been a phantom all along. I took a step backward, but the ground beneath my feet had also begun to shift in the mist, uncertain and unreal. My mind searched for logic, for some explanation rooted in memory or perception, but nothing fit. The lighthouse, the keeper, the scratches, the lamp, the footsteps, they were all fading into the gray, and I was left alone in a space that seemed both endless and collapsing at once. A strange calm settled over me. The panic I might have felt earlier had dissipated into quiet awareness. The fog pressed against my skin, curling into my coat and hair, but it carried no malice. Instead, it seemed patient, eternal, a presence that waited without impatience, that observed without judgment. I could almost imagine it as the keeper himself, folded into the mist, still vigilant, still marking, still watching the edge of the cliffs. I stepped forward, the lantern light flickering and dimming, and the fog swallowed it entirely. I felt my own outline disappear, my senses reduced to sound and sensation alone. The wind pressed against me, carrying the distant roar of the ocean, carrying whispers I could not understand, but somehow understood on a level beyond words. The lighthouse had vanished completely now, leaving no trace of its existence, as if it had never been. Only the fog remained, dense, infinite, and unknowable. I realized then that the world itself had shifted. The cliffs, the rocks, the waves, everything had been rearranged in subtle ways. Nothing looked wrong, but nothing looked familiar. The lighthouse had not been destroyed, it had been absorbed. And in its absence it left an echo, a memory pressed against perception, an awareness that whispered insistently, "Remember, watch, follow, endure." I wandered through the mist for hours, or perhaps minutes or days. Time had lost meaning. The sound of my own footsteps on the unseen ground echoed impossibly, folding back onto themselves, mingling with other sounds I could not place. A lantern light here, a shadow there, a fleeting impression of something moving beyond sight. The fog was alive with memory, with presence, with vigilance. I understood in that moment that the keeper's fear, his obsession, his isolation, they had not ended. They had become part of the mist, part of the world, part of me. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice was swallowed immediately, carried away by the gray. I listened instead to the subtle shifts in sound, to the patterns of wind, to the faint, impossible echoes of footsteps that may or may not have been mine. I knew that the lighthouse was still here somewhere, folded into the mist, waiting for the next observer, the next intruder, the next witness to its persistent, eternal vigilance. The thought was both terrifying and comforting. I was part of something larger than myself, entwined with the place, the fog, the vanished structure. The lighthouse had not abandoned me. It had absorbed me, and I had absorbed it. My mind stretched, reaching toward understanding, yet understanding remained just out of reach, like the light of the lamp that never shone. I moved through the fog, each step a negotiation with the unseen, each breath carrying the salt of the ocean and the weight of memory. The echoes of the spiral staircase returned, faint, rhythmic, impossibly present, yet elusive. I realized I would never truly leave Hollow Point, would never truly leave the lighthouse, would never leave the fog. It had claimed the keeper, and now it had claimed me. And perhaps it would claim all who sought it, all who climbed the stairs, all who dared witness its impossible presence. Eventually, the world became uniform gray, and I could no longer distinguish sky from ocean from land. My lantern had dimmed to nothing, leaving me in near complete darkness, yet I was not afraid. The fog carried me now, moving me forward through cliffs that may or may not exist, over waves that may or may not roar. I realized with a strange, eerie clarity that the lighthouse had vanished from sight, leaving no trace of its existence, yet it remained. It was not a place, it was an experience, a presence, an awareness that defied logic, defied measurement, defied the world I had known before. I took a final step into the mist, letting it press against me, let it absorb me. The sound of the ocean became the rhythm of my heartbeat. The whispers of wind became the cadence of my own awareness. And though the lighthouse was gone, though the spiral staircase, the lamp, the scratches, and the keeper's journals had disappeared into the gray, I knew that I carried them within me, folded into perception, into memory, into the endless fog that was now my world. Somewhere deep in the mist, I thought I heard the faint echo of a lamp trying to ignite, a single footstep tracing the spiral staircase, and a whisper that I could not fully place. The lighthouse may have vanished, but its presence endured. The fog had become the vessel, and I was now part of it, a witness folded into eternity, waiting and watching in the gray. And in that eternal gray, I understood the final truth of Hollow Point. Some places do not end. They persist, patient, infinite, elusive, and those who seek them are never truly free to leave. The building stood at the edge of town, weathered and crooked, like a forgotten relic that the world had simply walked past. Its windows were clouded with age, the paint peeling in long, curling strips that revealed layers of forgotten colors beneath. I had found it listed online as a boarding house, long abandoned, with only a single room available for rent. The price was absurdly low, and perhaps that should have warned me, but I was drawn to it by curiosity, or something quieter, something that whispered of secrets waiting behind locked doors. I arrived on a gray, wind-tangled afternoon. The air carried the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves, the sort of smell that clung to clothing and hair and refused to be shaken off. I approached the front door slowly. Its handle was cold, and when I turned it, it gave a low groan as though startled by my touch. The door opened to reveal a narrow hallway, lined with faded wallpaper, patterned in flowers that might once have been cheerful but now looked tired and sunken, like faces watching me with long dead eyes. A note on the desk by the door explained that the owner had passed years ago, leaving the keys for this one room with a caretaker down the street. I had met him briefly, a gaunt man with a nervous twitch in his left eye who handed me a set of heavy brass keys. "Be careful," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder. "It's not empty in a way most people mean." I laughed awkwardly, though his words stuck with me, curling into the corners of my thoughts like a spider thread I couldn't shake. I stepped into the room. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I immediately sensed the weight of the space. The floorboards creaked under my boots, the paint on the walls flaked as I brushed against it, and a chill, not entirely from the draft, ran along my spine. The furniture was sparse, a small bed with a thin mattress, a dresser with warped drawers, and a nightstand that seemed oddly polished despite the dust covering the rest of the room. It was as though someone had been here recently, arranging, waiting. But the house had been abandoned for decades, as every sign outside confirmed. I moved cautiously, running my hand along the walls. The wallpaper had been torn in one corner, revealing wood beneath, and I noticed scratches in the paint, fine but deliberate, almost like tally marks. I counted them, but their purpose was elusive. Some kind of record, perhaps, left by someone who had hoped to mark time or ward off something unseen. I shivered, telling myself it was imagination. But imagination didn't make the scratches so precise, so evenly spaced. The window was cracked, a jagged line through the glass, and I could see the overgrown garden beyond. Shadows moved in the unkempt grass, or maybe they were simply trees in the wind. The sun had begun to sink behind a curtain of clouds, and the room darkened gradually, the pale light casting long, slow-moving shapes across the floor. I felt the quiet press in around me, the kind of silence that carries weight, that seems to listen. I unpacked my bag, trying to distract myself, but every object I touched, the small wooden chair, the thin sheets, the dresser drawers, seemed to hum faintly, as though the room itself had a memory that responded to my presence. I placed my notebook on the nightstand, my pen beside it, and sat heavily on the bed. The mattress sagged under me, and I could hear the springs groaning like old joints under pressure. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, subtle and insistent. It was then that I noticed the first anomaly. A photograph had fallen from the back of a dresser drawer. I picked it up carefully, the edges curling with age. It was black and white, showing a group of people posed in front of the building. Their faces were bright with smiles, but their eyes, though hard to discern fully, seemed oddly empty, as though something lay behind them, hidden but present. A caption on the bottom edge in faded ink read simply, "The Hollow Days, 1923." I turned the photograph over, searching for more, some explanation, but the back was blank. My hand trembled slightly as I set it down on the nightstand. I could feel the weight of history pressing in, a story unspoken. Lives ended abruptly, quietly, and perhaps violently. Newspapers had once detailed the boarding house's tragedies, though the articles were yellowed and torn long before my time. Murders, disappearances, whispered rumors of deaths that made no sense. Some had claimed the house itself had absorbed the souls of the victims, holding them in the walls, in the floors, in the shadows that lingered when no one else was watching. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. I was tired, yes, from the long day of travel. The wind rattled the window pane, and the room seemed colder than it should have been. I lit a small lamp I had brought, its warm glow pushing back some of the shadows, but not all. The corners remained deep and black, and I felt them watching me in turn, patient, waiting. I walked slowly around the room, testing every surface, every creaking board. The dresser drawers were empty save for dust. The chair was solid, the bed frame sturdy. Nothing appeared to be missing or moved. And yet the air was thick, as though I had entered a space already charged with the lingering energy of others, memories perhaps, or warnings. I pressed my palm to the wall, feeling the chill through the plaster, and in that touch I imagined the echoes of footsteps, voices faint but distinct, conversations that had once happened and now lingered in resonance. I sat on the edge of the bed again, notebook in hand, and began to write, trying to capture the feeling, the subtle dread. The words came slowly, reluctantly, as if the room resisted being described fully. The more I wrote, the more I felt it, an awareness, delicate but persistent, brushing against my thoughts. Something unseen had been here, watching, observing, leaving traces for those who would notice. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the same malevolent patience that had trapped previous tenants. The evening deepened into night, and the lamp's glow cast long, quivering shadows across the floor. I heard a soft creak, almost imperceptible, like a floorboard settling or like a footstep elsewhere. My head snapped up. Silence. I told myself it was the house settling with age. Yet the instinct in my chest, the unease curling like smoke in my lungs, told me it was something more. A presence. Waiting, patient, interested. I moved to the window and peered out. The garden was a tangle of wild growth, nothing moving beyond the sway of branches. Yet I felt eyes on me, somewhere beyond the pane or perhaps within the room itself. I swallowed hard, my tongue dry. The boarding house, I realized, had been empty for decades, yet it was far from uninhabited. Its history pressed against me, thick and weighty, making the air almost impossible to breathe comfortably. I returned to the bed, lamp between us, notebook on my knees. I wrote slowly, each word deliberate, as though speaking aloud might summon whatever lingered. I told myself stories to explain the noises, the cold, the feeling of presence. But I could not shake the impression that someone, or something, had been watching me since the door closed behind me, and that it would continue to watch as long as I remained in the room. Hours passed, though time felt strange, stretched and warped by the silence and the shadows. I finally lay down, covering myself with the thin sheet, trying to rest. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. A floorboard creaked softly. I told myself it was nothing, though my chest tightened. I realized that no matter how empty the room seemed, it carried history, memory, observation. It had absorbed tragedies, absorbed fear, absorbed the lives that had passed through it. And now perhaps it had absorbed me as well. Sleep came in shallow waves, dreamlike, punctuated by whispers I could not quite place. Names, fragments of conversations, echoes of laughter and cries, all mingled in the darkness. I woke at intervals, listening, convinced I had heard soft knocks, the slide of a chair, the faintest brush of movement just beyond the corner of vision. The room was empty, yes, yet it was far from silent. The history it carried was alive in ways I could not define, patient, deliberate, and waiting. When dawn approached, the pale gray light spilling through the window, I realized that I had not been entirely alone. The boarding house had remained vigilant, observing my presence, assessing me as the previous tenants had been assessed. And in that realization, I understood a subtle, unnerving truth. The room was never truly empty, and those who entered carried its history with them, entwined and impossible to shake off. I held the keys in my hand, turning them over slowly. They were heavy, not just with metal, but with the weight of countless lives and countless stories, of tragedies and disappearances, of silent observation. I placed them carefully on the nightstand, not daring to lock the room, for I knew it mattered little. The space would endure, patient, silent, always watching, ready for the next curious soul to enter and be reminded that emptiness is a fragile illusion. I woke to the pale light of morning slipping through the cracked window, filtered into dull gray by the dust and age on the glass. The room smelled faintly of damp wood and old paper, a scent that seemed to carry the memories of everyone who had ever lived or died here. I lingered on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening. Silence mostly, though it carried weight, a presence that did not speak but watched. I had grown accustomed to it overnight, but the instinct to look over my shoulder remained stubbornly alive. I rose slowly and approached the wall near the dresser. The wallpaper, once floral and bright, was now sunken and peeling, curling at the edges like brittle leaves. Something about the patterns had caught my attention even before I noticed the photographs. The flowers and vines twisted in ways that seemed unnatural, as if the design itself had grown with intent, almost aware of the room's history. And then I saw it, faint impressions beneath the paper, outlines that did not belong to the wallpaper's design. Faces, human faces pressed into the wall itself, features worn smooth with age but unmistakably there. Eyes, noses, mouths, subtle but present, starring from behind layers of time. I knelt, pressing a finger gently against the paper where one face seemed the clearest. The wall was cold beneath my touch, colder than it should have been, and a shiver ran up my arm. The more I looked, the more faces I saw, some smiling, some terrified, some frozen in expressions I could not fully read. They seemed to move slightly when I blinked, shifting as if watching my movements, studying me. The idea that this was merely decay seemed impossible. There was intention here, a deliberate trace left behind, perhaps by the same unseen hand that had watched, waited, and claimed previous tenants. I walked slowly along the wall, running my hand over the peeling paper. Each section seemed to reveal another face, another fragment of the past. A man with sharp cheekbones, a woman clutching something unseen, a child whose mouth was open as if to call out. The impressions were subtle but unmistakable. I realized with a tightening in my chest that these were the people who had lived here, perhaps the ones who had disappeared or died. The boarding house remembered them, and it had embedded them into its very walls. Near the corner, I noticed a small collection of photographs tucked beneath a flap of wallpaper. I carefully peeled it back and found images, faded and curling with age, depicting the same residents whose faces were pressed into the wall. Each photograph was annotated in handwriting that trembled slightly, ink faded to brown, names, dates, and occasionally the word missing. The alignment was too deliberate to be coincidental. These were records, memories, reminders. I could almost feel their gazes as I held them, each pair of eyes pressing into mine with quiet insistence. I set the photographs down on the dresser and stepped back, letting my eyes roam over the wall. The peeling wallpaper had formed a tapestry of the past, each face a silent witness to what had occurred here. I imagined them moving slightly when I wasn't looking, drifting just behind my peripheral vision. The air seemed heavier now, charged with something that was not quite air at all. A pulse, perhaps, or the echo of long past presence. The room's corners had always been dark, but now they seemed alive. Shadows pooled in impossible angles, stretching thin across the ceiling and floor. I tried to rationalize, telling myself the play of morning light on dust and wall imperfections explained it all. But I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that this was more than simple trickery of the eye. The boarding house had absorbed its inhabitants, or perhaps their memories, leaving them here to linger, patient and watchful. I sat on the edge of the bed, notebook in hand, attempting to capture the experience. Words felt inadequate, spilling slowly, reluctantly across the page. The faces were everywhere, embedded and etched into perception. I imagined the lives behind them, the quiet breakfasts, the whispered arguments, the laughter now muted, echoing only in the walls. And yet there was something darker too. A fear that had settled into the room over the years. A quiet tension that spoke of vanished tenants, of unexplained deaths, of lingering sorrow. Hours passed in a haze of observation. I moved around the room repeatedly, touching each section of wallpaper, examining the photographs, trying to discern any pattern, any clue to the lives that had been lived and ended here. I noticed that some faces appeared to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if the room itself nudged them just slightly out of alignment. My pulse quickened with each discovery, and yet I felt a strange calm too, as if understanding the house's memory required acceptance of its quiet authority. In the afternoon, I explored the small cabinet by the dresser. Inside, I found letters, some neatly stacked, others folded and worn with handling. The handwriting was elegant yet tense. Words of love, apology, fear, resignation. Some mentioned the boarding house explicitly, others only hinted at the unease that had filled its walls. One letter, dated nearly 70 years ago, spoke of hearing whispers in the night and of the watchful eyes behind every corner. It ended abruptly, the last words cut off as though the writer had been interrupted, or perhaps silenced. I felt a tightness in my chest. The room was not simply haunted by memory, it was haunted by the act of remembering itself. Each face in the wallpaper, each photograph, each letter, it was all part of the boarding house's persistence. It endured not in the physical sense alone, but in the psychological, the emotional, the spectral. And now I was part of it, recorded in its perception merely by being present. Evening fell slowly. The sun sank low, casting long, muted shadows that stretched across the floor and walls. The faces in the wallpaper seemed to sharpen in the dim light, their eyes catching faint glimmers from my lamp. I found myself speaking softly to them, asking questions I did not expect to be answered. "Who were you?" I whispered. "Why are you still here?" My voice seemed to vanish instantly into the room, swallowed by the weight of history and dust and memory. No reply came, but the sensation of being observed intensified. I moved the dresser slightly to examine the wall behind it. The peeling wallpaper revealed a larger, hidden image beneath. A mural, perhaps once cheerful, now warped and stained with age, depicting a group of people gathered in a room not unlike this one. Their faces were subtly distorted, smiles too wide, eyes too empty, yet the sense of life was undeniable. I felt my stomach tight. This was more than decoration. This was a record, a witness. A map of presence, lingering long after bodies had vanished. Night arrived fully, and the room became a theater of shadows. I lit a small candle I had brought, the flame trembling as it cast flickering light over the faces in the wallpaper. Each flicker seemed to animate the features slightly, breathing a kind of quiet life into them. I could hear creaks and sighs in the building, subtle but deliberate. Perhaps the house itself was shifting, reacting to my attention, allowing me glimpses of its history only when I acknowledged it. I sat back on the bed, notebook in hand, and let the candlelight wash over the wall. The faces, the photographs, the letters, they all became part of a single living memory. I realized that I had crossed into the boarding house's domain fully now. It was no longer simply a place I rented. It was a presence I had entered, a consciousness that had absorbed decades of human experience and now observed me in turn. Sleep came unevenly that night. In dreams, I saw the faces in wallpaper animate fully, stepping from the walls and walking the narrow halls, lingering at doorways, watching silently. Voices whispered behind closed doors, some kind, some sharp, some sorrowful. I woke repeatedly, listening to the empty room, feeling the eyes upon me, counting the creaks and groans of settling boards as if they carried intent. The boarding house was patient, waiting, and I understood then that it always had been. By morning, I accepted it. The boarding house was alive in a way that defied explanation, its memory long, deliberate, and unyielding. The faces in the wallpaper were no longer merely echoes, they were witnesses. And I, in choosing to inhabit this room, had become part of their ongoing story. The night arrived slowly, heavier than any evening I had known. Outside, the wind rattled loose shingles and sent a low groan through the walls of the boarding house. Inside, the room I had begun to call mine, though it hardly felt like a room anymore, seemed to shrink under the weight of darkness. Shadows pooled in the corners, long and still at first, then twitching, flickering like they carried a life of their own. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet hum of the old building, the occasional creak of floorboards settling. I had convinced myself that the house was simply old and frail, that its groans were natural, but that rational thought felt increasingly hollow. It started as a movement in the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was the wind catching loose shutters or perhaps an animal in the rafters. But then I saw it again, a shadow, elongated and thin, slipping across the crack beneath the door. It was deliberate, smooth, a shape moving with intention. I held my breath, heart hammering quietly, unwilling to make a sound that might draw attention to myself. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The hallway was silent. Not silent like an empty room, but a silence weighted with expectation, as though the air itself was holding its breath. My mind raced. The house had never been empty, not fully. Its walls were saturated with memory, disappearances, whispered arguments, the echo of footsteps that had walked these halls decades ago. I reminded myself that imagination could be cruel in such a place, yet the instinct to believe in what I saw was stronger than the rational voice in my head. I got up, moving slowly to the door. Each step made the floorboards groan, but somehow that sound did not betray my presence. I placed my hand on the doorknob, cold and smooth beneath my palm, and slowly cracked the door open. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the thin light of a street lamp seeping through a high window at the far end. Nothing moved. No one, no shadow. Only the familiar dust motes drifting in the faint glow. I exhaled quietly, leaning back against the doorframe. Perhaps it was the house adjusting to my presence, I thought. Perhaps the shadows were my own fear made visible. Yet as I turned back toward the room, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure flitting across the far end of the hallway, quick and silent, vanishing as soon as I tried to focus on it. I froze, my pulse surged. This was no trick of the eye. The house itself seemed alive in the dark, carrying memory like a pulse in the walls. The shadows were not just reflections or tricks, they were echoes. Echoes of past tenants or of crimes committed within these walls, replaying themselves in a loop that had no audience beyond me. I felt watched, my every movement noted by unseen eyes. Returning to the room, I locked the door, though I knew it would do little good. Locks were meaningless here. The air seemed thicker now, pressing against me, filled with a subtle static of whispers. I sat down, notebook in hand, and tried to capture the sensations, but words failed me. The whispers were fragments, almost imperceptible at first, soft murmurs of names, dates, apologies, and arguments I could not fully decipher. They rose and fell with the rhythm of the wind outside, growing just loud enough for me to strain my ears. A phrase floated through the darkness, clear yet distant. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, heart hammering. The voice was not loud, but it carried weight, urgency, a familiarity that made my blood run cold. I could not tell if it was spoken by the house itself, by some lingering soul, or if my mind had conjured it from the tension of the evening. I dared not speak aloud. I dared not move more than necessary. The shadows grew bolder. Shapes shifted across the room, thin, fleeting, yet deliberate. I could not tell how many there were. Some appeared as hunched figures, others taller like men in coats, though time had long claimed the details. Each one moved with intent, weaving between walls, slipping behind doors, vanishing as I turned my gaze. And in each moment they appeared, I felt a tug at my mind, a whisper at the edges of memory. The boarding house remembered. It remembered everything, and it did not like being observed. I tried to anchor myself. I focused on my breathing, slow and deliberate, counting each exhale. Yet the whispers persisted, layering over one another until I could not distinguish one voice from the next. Names, accusations, apologies, warnings, all mixed into a murmur that pressed against the walls of my skull. My hands shook slightly as I wrote, the pen dragging across paper, desperate to make sense of the chaos. But no sense could be made here, not yet, perhaps never. A soft creak near the closet made me glance toward it. I told myself it was the house settling again, though every rational thought felt fragile. The door handle wobbled slightly as if nudged by some invisible hand. I swallowed hard, resisting the urge to flee, though the desire clawed at me. My notebook slipped slightly from my hands as I leaned forward, straining to listen. The whispering grew clearer for a moment, forming words I could almost understand. "Leave while you still can." I sat frozen, the candle flickering between the shadows, revealing glimpses of patterns in the darkness. The peeling wallpaper in the corner seemed to pulse subtly, as if breathing in time with the house itself. I recalled the faces I had seen there before, and a chill ran through me. Perhaps they were the source of these whispers, the residents who had vanished, trapped in some echo between life and memory, replaying their final moments endlessly. Perhaps the shadows and whispers were invitations, or warnings, or simply reminders of the lives that had been claimed here. I forced myself to breathe, counting each second carefully. Slowly, the noises became less distinct, settling into the creaks and groans of the old building. Yet the sense of being observed did not fade. Every flicker of candlelight seemed to carry a new silhouette. Every passing shadow hinted at movement. My mind questioned my senses, but I knew the truth. This place was not merely abandoned. It was inhabited in ways that defied explanation, populated by memory, fear, and the residue of past crimes. Hours passed with only the occasional whisper, soft and fragmented, as I scribbled notes feverishly. My skin crawled with the awareness of every movement in the room. When I dared look up, I sometimes thought I saw figures reflected in the corners of mirrors, standing just out of reach. I refused to approach them, knowing instinctively that such an action was pointless, or perhaps dangerous. Observation, I realized, was the boarding house's choice, not mine. I was merely a guest in a place that held sway over time itself. By midnight, the whispers seemed to ebb slightly, leaving a faint echo that hung in the air like the last note of a song. I felt my muscles relax marginally, though tension still lurked beneath the surface. I remained on the bed, notebook in lap, candle flickering softly beside me, waiting for what I could not say. Perhaps the shadows had stories left unfinished, messages meant to reach me if I could endure long enough to listen. Perhaps they had noticed me, the living interloper, and were gauging whether I belonged or could survive the night. I did not sleep deeply, though. Every shift of the wind, every creak of a floorboard, and every faint rustle in the dark kept me alert. The boarding house seemed to breathe around me, inhaling and exhaling slowly, carrying the weight of decades of lives long past, of secrets that would not die quietly. And somewhere in the murmur I sensed a promise, or a warning, that the night was not yet over, and that its visitors, long dead, long lost, or imagined, were still very much present. By dawn, I had accepted a delicate balance. I would observe without interfering, listen without trying to comprehend fully. The shadows might vanish in the light and the whispers might fall silent temporarily, but I knew the house would remember me, as it had remembered all who came before. And when night returned, so too would the visitors, patient and silent, waiting for the next intruder, willing, or foolish, enough to witness their quiet eternity. The discovery came not with a bang, but a soft click beneath the worn rug near the corner of my room. I had noticed the floorboards were uneven there, and the edges of the rug frayed in a way that seemed intentional, almost like a signal. At first, I hesitated, imagining that I had simply missed something in my earlier explorations. But the sense of curiosity, or was it compulsion, was irresistible. Slowly, I lifted the rug, careful not to make noise, and found a small latch set into the wood. The metal was tarnished with age but functional. My fingers trembled as I pressed it, and the latch gave with a muted resistance. A section of the floor shifted, revealing a narrow stairway leading down into darkness. The air rising from below was stale, damp, and carried a faint metallic tang. I paused at the top, listening. Silence, except for the low creak of the floorboards beneath my weight and the distant, hollow whistle of wind through the building. I told myself it was just a storage room or perhaps a wine cellar, some forgotten space left to rot. Yet the weight in my chest suggested otherwise. There was intent here, purpose. Something hidden, waiting. I descended slowly, each step creaking sharply, echoing into the shadows below. The air grew colder with every footfall, heavier, pressing against my lungs. My flashlight cast a thin circle of light across the walls, revealing dust-coated shelves and scattered objects that had long been abandoned. But then I noticed the first sign that this was no ordinary storage room. A blood-stained cloth pinned to the far wall, its edges frayed and darkened by time. I froze, stomach turning. The smell of rust lingered faintly in the air, just enough to suggest the past had not fully let go. I moved closer, careful to avoid disturbing anything else. The walls were lined with evidence of lives violently interrupted. Photographs, letters, and personal items arranged with meticulous care, almost ritualistic. Faces in the photos stared back at me, eyes wide with the shock of their final moments. There were scraps of journals, torn pages scattered across the floor, some detailing mundane lives, others abruptly ending with frantic scrawls about being watched or someone in the house. My heart pounded as I realized I had stumbled into a record of horror. A single photograph lay on the floor in the center of the room, prominently displayed as if demanding my attention. It showed a man standing in a doorway, features twisted in anger or fear. I couldn't tell which. A knife was visible in his hand, glinting even in the faded light. Around him, the room was chaotic. Overturned furniture, broken glass, blood spatters. I forced myself to breathe, trying to rationalize, but the instinct to flee clawed at me. Yet another force, some morbid curiosity, compelled me to stay. I picked up one of the scattered journals, its leather cover cracked and stiff. The handwriting inside was hurried, panicked, the words sometimes looping over themselves as if the writer had been too scared to stop. The entries recounted a series of disappearances in the boarding house, spanning decades, each ending in a horrifying note. The victims were last seen in the area I now stood in. The author described hearing footsteps at night, whispers in the walls, glimpses of shadowy figures that vanished when approached. My pulse quickened. The parallels to my own experience were undeniable. I had entered a history that was still alive. A creak sounded behind me. I whipped around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, revealing nothing. The room was empty, or so it appeared. I knew better. The air felt charged, thick with expectation, as if the house itself was aware I had found its secret. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, not aggressively, but with a quiet insistence that I understand my place here. An observer, yes, but also a participant. The farther I explored, the more I uncovered. A small wooden table against the far wall held remnants of the unsolved crimes. A rusted knife, a bloodied handkerchief, a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. Each item was preserved with a care that bordered on obsessive. I realized these were not just relics, they were trophies, left behind by someone who had once moved freely in the boarding house, and perhaps still did unseen. The thought made my stomach churn, yet I could not tear my gaze away. I crouched beside the table, taking note of the details. The knife bore markings that suggested repeated use. The handkerchief had initials stitched into the corner, letters I recognized from one of the journals. I traced the ribbon in my mind, imagining the story it represented, the fear, the struggle, the sudden, irrevocable silence. The room was not merely a hiding place. It was a shrine, a testament to acts of violence that had never been solved. And somehow I had walked directly into its center. The shadows shifted subtly as I moved. My flashlight flickered, and I could swear a figure darted behind a pillar, vanishing before I could focus. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing in volume, forming fragmented sentences that reached just beyond comprehension. He comes, they watch, you know too much. The voice was neither male nor female, neither here nor entirely absent. It was the accumulation of the boarding house's memory, a chorus of the past pressing into the present. I stepped back, suddenly aware that I had been holding my breath for longer than I realized. The weight of the room seemed almost physical, pressing on my shoulders, my chest, my skull. I felt dizzy, unsteady, as if the floor itself might give way beneath me. The journal slipped from my hands, thudding softly against the floor, and I knelt to retrieve it, my hands brushing against a photograph I hadn't noticed before. It was an image of the room I now occupied, but from decades prior. The table, the knife, the handkerchief, everything was arranged identically. And in the shadows of the photo, a figure lurked, staring directly at the camera, its face obscured, yet unmistakably present. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table for support. My mind raced. The boarding house was not only alive with memory, it had recorded itself, preserved it, replayed it. Every act of violence, every disappearance, every whispered secret was embedded in the structure, waiting for the next person foolish enough to witness it. And now, I was part of that record. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that time and decay had aligned everything into this grotesque display. But the arrangement was too deliberate. The air itself hummed with the presence of lives interrupted, of shadows that lingered long after the flesh had rotted, of whispers that refused to die. I could feel their eyes on me, each one a fragment of memory, a shard of consciousness still tethered to the boarding house. I moved toward the narrow stairway I had used to descend, intending to leave, but the room seemed to stretch subtly. The walls shifted imperceptibly, elongating the shadows, closing the space around me. The whispers grew louder, forming nearly coherent words. "Stay, you belong, you understand." My heart pounded in my ears. The dread was not sudden, it was cumulative, a slow pressure that had been building since I first entered the house. I realized then that escape might not be possible, not fully. Not while the boarding house remembered me. I took one last photograph of the room with my phone, hoping to capture proof of what I had found, though I knew images could not convey the weight, the pressure, the unrelenting attention of the place. The shadows flickered across the walls as I ascended the stairs, and I could hear whispers trailing after me, faint, insistent, echoing in the wooden shaft. "You will remember. You cannot leave. We are always here." I emerged into my room, trembling, breath ragged. The latch closed behind me with a dull click, but the feeling of the hidden room lingered. I could still sense it in the walls, in the floor beneath my feet, in the subtle shiver of the air around me. The boarding house had claimed something of me, some fragment of attention, of awareness, of fear. I was not free. I was now part of its memory, part of its record, part of the echoes that would haunt its halls long after I left. I sat on the edge of the bed, notebook in hand, candlelight flickering softly. Outside, the wind continued its low, mournful song, rattling the windows and carrying the faint scent of damp earth and old wood. I understood fully now that the boarding house was patient. It waited not just for observation, but for participation. It recorded, it replayed, it remembered. And now it would not forget me. Even as sleep beckoned, it felt fragile, uncertain. Shadows lingered at the corners of the room, not fully there, not fully absent. The whispers were faint now, teasing, reminding me that the night was never truly silent, the house never truly empty. I could not forget the faces, the items, the traces of horror I had witnessed. They were locked into my memory, and by extension, I was locked into theirs. The boarding house had claimed its latest witness. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the old building. Each sound was a reminder that the past was never gone, that the present was merely a thin layer over a long history of darkness. I could close my eyes, try to rest, but I knew the hidden room was not empty. It waited, patient, inevitable, eternal. And in that knowledge, I felt the true weight of dread settle over me, slow and unyielding, as if I had been trapped in the boarding house's memory from the moment I first set foot inside. The fog lay thick over Hollow Creek, curling around the gravestones like fingers of smoke that refused to lift. I had arrived just as dawn struggled to pierce the morning haze, the sun a pale, reluctant disk behind the low clouds. The cemetery stretched before me, uneven ground punctuated by stones of all sizes, some cracked and leaning with age, others unnervingly straight as if placed yesterday. I stepped carefully, boots sinking into damp soil, each footfall swallowed by the mist. The first thing I noticed was how clean the stones were. After decades, some even a century, the graves were oddly well kept. Moss had not claimed them entirely, and the inscriptions were legible, the letters sharp against the weathered rock. I crouched over one, brushing a hand across the carved name. Martha Finley, 1898–1923. I tried to picture her life, the town she had lived in, the hands that had shaped her gravestone. There was a presence here, though faint, as though someone, or something, had continued to tend to her resting place long after the world had forgotten. I walked further, past rows of upright stones and toppled crosses, past graves where the names were so old they were nearly erased. Some were adorned with fresh flowers, inexplicable in a town abandoned for decades. I paused at a small grouping near the edge of the cemetery. They were child-sized graves, neat and carefully aligned. The thought struck me cold. Who had remembered them after all these years? The fog shifted, hiding the edges of the plot, and for a moment I felt as if I were being watched, not by birds or animals, but by unseen eyes that lingered among the stones. A faint sound reached me then, a scraping, subtle like gravel moved across soil. I froze. There was no wind strong enough to carry such a sound. The fog thickened, blurring the outlines of the graves into a monochrome of shadow and shape. My heart quickened, but I reminded myself to breathe, to keep calm. Hollow Creek had been deserted for decades. There should be no one here. And yet the signs of recent care, the polished stones, the arrangement of small trinkets, the faint footprints in the dew, suggested otherwise. I followed a narrow path between two rows of stones, each step slow and deliberate. The fog wrapped around me, cold and damp, seeping into the collar of my coat. I passed a grave marked with a single word, unknown. The stone was newer than many, gray and sharp, untouched by time. Beneath it, the earth seemed disturbed. I knelt to examine it, fingers brushing the surface. The soil was loose, as if recently turned. My stomach tight. Perhaps someone had dug here, perhaps not. The line between reason and fear was already blurred. Further along, I found a small, weathered bench facing a cluster of graves. Carved into the wood were initials, long faded but still visible, and a date from the 1920s. Someone had sat here once, I thought, watching over these graves, whispering words no living person would hear now. I imagined the weight of loneliness that must have pressed on them, tending to the dead in a town slowly vanishing from memory. I wondered if they had waited for someone to arrive, for someone like me, to witness what had been preserved so carefully. The cemetery was silent, but silence in Hollow Creek was not emptiness. It was a presence, patient and observant. Every shadow seemed heavier here, every shape elongated by the fog. I passed a grave with a small doll perched on the stone, its porcelain face cracked, eyes staring blankly. Beside it was a note, the edges yellowed with age. "Do not forget us." My throat tightened. It was not recent, not exactly, but the paper retained a weight that suggested someone had placed it with intention, or perhaps it had remained in place because it was never meant to be removed. I stopped near a mausoleum, its iron gate rusted and creaking faintly in the slight wind. The fog seeped inside the entrance, hiding the floor and the steps beyond. I could feel the cold emanating from within, a deeper chill than the morning air. Something about it drew me closer, an almost magnetic pull. I rested a hand on the gate. It swung slightly, almost of its own volition, revealing darkness so complete I could not see the bottom step. The air smelled of damp stone and decay, yet beneath it lingered something else, a faint hint of perfume, of life, of memory. I stepped back uneasy and turned to survey the rest of the cemetery. There were more graves, more signs of attention, more whispers carried by the fog. I could feel stories pressing toward me, histories of lives cut short, of love and loss, of deeds unrecorded by the living. A small gravestone caught my eye. It bore the initials H.J. and a date, 1910. At its base, a collection of smooth stones had been arranged in a circle. I knelt to examine them. Each stone bore a tiny, delicate carving, some hearts, some stars, some symbols I could not identify. Someone had been here recently. Someone had remembered. I wandered further, tracing a path along the outer edge of the cemetery. The fog shifted constantly, making familiar graves disappear and reappear like ghosts of memory. My boots sank into soft soil, and I could hear the faint drip of moisture from the stones above. Then I heard it, a whisper almost imperceptible carried on the wind. I stopped, straining to hear. "Watch, watch," it seemed to hiss. I spun in place, flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing. Only fog, only silence. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A small family plot appeared ahead, surrounded by a low wrought iron fence. Inside, the stones were polished to a shine, the inscriptions crisp. Fresh flowers, long wilted, lay carefully at the base of each stone. Someone had maintained this plot, someone invisible. I pressed my hand against the cool iron fence, feeling the damp, and tried to understand. Why maintain a cemetery in a town abandoned for decades? Who or what continued this labor? The question pressed into my mind, unrelenting, leaving only the slow, creeping certainty that Hollow Creek was not as empty as it seemed. I lingered there for a long time, tracing the names, imagining the lives behind them. Children, miners, shopkeepers, teachers, all gone, yet here in the fog their presence remained stubborn, persistent. The stones were their voices now, speaking quietly to anyone who would listen. And I realized slowly that I was listening, that I had come in search of history, of emptiness, but found memory instead. The cemetery was a keeper of stories, of secrets, and perhaps of those who refused to die quietly. A sudden movement caught my eye, a shadow flitting across the edge of the fog. My pulse quickened. I convinced myself it was a deer, a trick of the mist, anything rational. Yet the instinctive sense of being watched did not fade. I could feel eyes on me, lingering just beyond sight, waiting, remembering. I took a step back, and the fog seemed to close in, thickening, compressing the air around me. The stones no longer appeared random. They were deliberate, arranged with purpose, each one a marker, a signal, a warning. I turned to leave, retracing my steps through the graves, but the fog had shifted again. The path I had come from seemed longer, twisted in ways that did not match my memory. I paused, breath visible in the cold air, and realized with a jolt that I had no sense of direction. The cemetery was alive with memory, with presence, and perhaps with intent. I could not tell if I was being guided or trapped. I walked slowly, deliberately, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground before me. Every so often I glanced at the stones, some leaning, some upright, all strangely well tended. The whispers returned, faint now, carried by the fog. "Remember, remember." The sound was not threatening, yet it filled me with a deep unease, a knowledge that I was now part of this place, an observer bound to the echoes of those who had come before. By the time I reached the edge of the cemetery, the fog was thinning slightly. I glanced back once, and the stones seemed to shimmer, as though acknowledging my departure, as though they had been watching me as closely as I had been watching them. I walked away, heart heavy, mind racing, and I could still feel the weight of countless memories pressing against the edges of my consciousness. Hollow Creek was empty, yes, but its cemetery was full, full of remembrance, full of watchers, full of secrets that would not let me go. Even as the mist faded behind me, I carried the sense of being observed, the knowledge that some presence lingered among the stones. And I understood fully that what had drawn me here was not just curiosity or history. It was the cemetery itself, calling, patient, inexorable. I returned to the cemetery the following morning, the fog thinner now but still curling around the stones like smoke unwilling to lift. The air was damp, heavy with that distinct scent of earth and decay that only cemeteries can hold. My boots sank into the softened soil as I walked, each step a muted thump on the moss-covered ground. I had to see it for myself. Those stones that seemed so carefully maintained, yet told stories that did not entirely make sense. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. Rows of graves, markers ranging from small, simple stones to grand monuments with engraved angels. But as I moved closer, I noticed the irregularities. Some stones bore only first names or initials, with the rest of the inscription blank. Others had dates but nothing else, as if someone had started the work and never finished. I crouched beside one that read only Samuel, followed by a rough, jagged line where the surname should have been. The stone was clean, polished, as though someone had rubbed it recently. The inconsistency made my stomach tighten. How could a grave be so carefully tended, yet remain so incomplete? I wandered down a narrow path between two leaning rows of graves. Each step revealed more anomalies. A grave marked EJ had fresh-looking letters etched deep into the stone, the carvings sharper than the rest. Next to it lay a small cluster of river rocks, neatly stacked, each smooth and cold to the touch. I could feel the intention behind them, deliberate and precise. Someone had been here not long ago, someone still engaged with the dead in ways I could barely comprehend. The deeper I walked into the cemetery, the stronger the sense of unease became. The fog thickened slightly again, muting the sounds of my movements. I could hear only the distant drip of moisture from the stones and the soft scrape of my boots against the soil. But beneath it, I sensed another presence, not human, or at least not entirely. I kept telling myself it was the wind, the trees, the imagination of someone alone in a forgotten place. Yet every so often, I caught the glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow, flickering between stones, gone before I could focus on it. I stopped at a particularly odd section, a grouping of graves that seemed older than the rest. Some were nearly unreadable, eroded by decades, yet scattered among them were fresh-looking stones, letters still sharp and clean. A chill ran down my spine. Someone was keeping these graves alive, tending to them carefully, even though no one alive remained to mourn. I crouched beside one of the newer stones. The name read, Lydia Harper, 1921. The blank after the dash was deliberate, as if someone had paused, waiting for her story to continue, or perhaps deciding it themselves. My gaze drifted over the other stones nearby, and that's when I noticed it. Faint, almost imperceptible scratches in the dirt at the base of a small monument. They looked recent, disturbed by someone kneeling or leaning against the stone. My heart thudded. I wasn't alone, though I had yet to see anyone. The cemetery was too quiet for a visitor, yet too purposeful in its maintenance for there to be none. I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against me, a patient watchfulness that refused to reveal itself fully. I moved further along, following a crooked path toward the center of the cemetery. Here, the graves seemed more deliberate, organized in strange, almost geometric patterns. One row formed a subtle arc, while another created a jagged line pointing toward the low hill at the cemetery's edge. I paused at a grave that seemed different from the others, small, almost child-sized, yet perfectly upright and pristine. The name etched into the stone was faintly familiar, though I couldn't place it. A.J. Holloway, 1915-1927. Fresh flowers lay at its base, wilted but not decayed. Someone had been here, watching, remembering. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it a whisper I almost missed. I froze. My eyes darted among the stones. Do not forget, the words were barely audible and yet unmistakable. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself. It was impossible, no one should have been here. And yet the words lingered in my mind, echoing as though the cemetery itself had spoken. I followed a path that led to a low, crumbling mausoleum at the center. Its iron door was rusted, yet the lock appeared recently oiled. I could see marks along the hinges, faint scratches that suggested someone, or something, had opened it not long ago. I shivered. Who had the time, the need to maintain this place? To carve letters into stones that were already old, to polish the weathered surfaces, to leave whispers for anyone who might stumble upon them. I crouched near another grave, a large rectangular stone that seemed almost too new to be here. The name read, Unknown 1909. The question mark seemed to hang in the air, daring me to answer. I ran my fingers over the rough surface, feeling the texture of fresh etching against the older, smoother stone. Whoever had done this was meticulous, careful, almost ritualistic. I could almost hear the slow scraping of chisel on stone, the deliberate pause between letters, as if each name carved carried weight, consequence. The fog shifted again, thickening into a veil that hid the edges of the cemetery. I felt disoriented, as though the ground had changed beneath my feet, the paths rearranged while I wasn't looking. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the shapes of the graves seemed to lean inward, curious, waiting. I kept telling myself it was the mist playing tricks on my perception, but deep down I knew it wasn't entirely natural. I reached a row of small headstones, each bearing only initials. ML, CH, RT. The letters were fresh, clearly carved within the last few months. I froze, the air thick around me. How could this be? The town had been abandoned for decades. There should be no one to tend to these graves, yet someone had been here and not long ago. The thought pressed against my chest, heavy and cold. I wanted to leave, to run, but my curiosity held me in place, rooted as firmly as the stones themselves. I crouched beside one of the newest stones. A small note, brittle and yellowed, was tucked beneath a corner. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. We remember, we watch. The words made the hair on my neck rise. Someone or some presence was leaving messages. Were they for the living, for the dead, or for me specifically? I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at my mind, leaving a lingering unease that refused to dissipate. As I rose, I glanced over the entire cemetery. The fog had begun to lift slightly, but the feeling of watchfulness persisted. The stones seemed alive, each name etched not just in stone but in memory, in care, in some unseen attention that stretched across decades. I could feel it pressing against me, quiet but insistent, a reminder that even in a town abandoned for generations, someone, or something, kept record. I turned to leave, moving along the narrow path I had entered from, yet I could not shake the sensation that I was being followed, though no footsteps echoed mine. The air was heavier here, carrying a subtle tension that made my breath catch. Names without faces, faces without names. They were watching, waiting, keeping account. I could feel it all around me, pressing softly yet unmistakably into my thoughts. By the time I reached the cemetery gate, the fog had thinned and sunlight filtered through, weak and pale. I paused, glancing back once more. The stones seemed unchanged, yet somehow different, sharper, intentional. I felt the weight of centuries of attention, of care, of memory that refused to die. I knew I had witnessed only a fraction of it, but the impression would stay with me, lingering in the edges of my mind, a whisper in every quiet moment. We are here. We are remembering. We have not left. I left Hollow Creek that morning with the sense that the cemetery was no longer just a place of graves. It was a ledger of lives, an archive maintained by hands unseen, perhaps by those who had once walked among the living, perhaps by something that persisted beyond them. Names without faces, dates without ends, whispers without voices, all of it pressed upon me, a quiet, insistent call to remember what should have been forgotten. And I knew, deep down, I would return. The wind had changed by the time I returned to the town. It was colder now, sharper, carrying a salt and earth tang from the edges of the surrounding hills. I could hear it before I even reached the first of the old buildings, a subtle hiss through broken windows and gaps in rotting wood. The town lay silent, but the silence itself seemed uneasy, as if it were merely waiting for the wind to awaken it. I moved cautiously along the cracked main street. The fog from the cemetery earlier had dissipated, but a thin haze clung to the town, softening the edges of shattered signs and sagging rooftops. I could make out the outlines of houses that had long since been abandoned, their windows like hollow eyes watching me pass. Each step echoed faintly, my own presence an intrusion into this careful stillness. That's when I first noticed it, the whispers. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, curling through the wind like smoke. I paused, holding my breath. The sound was fragmentary, like threads of conversation carried across decades. I could hear pieces of words, names, dates, but nothing whole. At first, I thought it was the wind passing over broken boards, a trick of acoustics. But there was a rhythm, a cadence that no mere wind could produce. I stepped closer to one of the larger houses, its paint peeled and warped. The whispers grew more distinct here. They spoke in low, hurried murmurs carrying the weight of memory, of things better left unspoken. I could make out fragments now. Never found, left him there. She cried alone, the phrases repeated, overlapping, as if the town itself were rehearsing the tragedies it had witnessed. I pressed my palm against the warped siding of the house, feeling the cold wood beneath my fingers. The whispers seemed to respond, shifting with the pressure of my touch. I could hear voices I had never known, recounting crimes and losses in a tone both accusatory and mournful. They spoke of vanished children, of fires set in desperation, of families torn apart by greed and envy. Each story was fragmented, like scraps of a diary fluttering in a storm. I moved down the street, drawn by the murmurs, compelled to follow them as if they could lead me somewhere. Broken furniture lay scattered across yards, overgrown with weeds. A swing creaked slightly in the wind, and I imagined the laughter of children long gone, the echo of footsteps running across dusty floors. The wind carried their voices with it, weaving together with the whispers until the town felt alive again, though it had been dead for decades. I entered what must have once been the town hall. The door creaked on rusted hinges, protesting my presence. Inside, the shadows were deep and still, but the voices intensified here, weaving together in an almost hypnotic pattern. I could hear names repeated over and over. Harper, Lillian, Thomas. Some sounded like warnings, others like confessions. I realized with a sinking feeling that the town remembered each life, each death, and chose to whisper them endlessly to anyone who would listen. A draft swept through the broken windows, carrying a particularly distinct voice. It was a man's tone, low and trembling. They should not have come, we warned them, my heart pounded. The voice was distant, yet there was a clarity to it that made me certain it was not imagined. I turned slowly, looking into the shadows, half expecting someone to step forward. Nothing did. Only the wind, carrying its tragic chorus, filled the room. I left the town hall and continued along the main street, the voices ebbing and flowing around me. Occasionally, a single phrase would pierce through. He was buried alive, or the children never returned. The specificity of the horrors unsettled me. These were not abstract whispers. They were memories recorded somewhere in the walls, the streets, the very air. It was as if the town itself had become a repository for suffering, unwilling to release it. I paused near a crumbling shop, its windows boarded but the door ajar. I could hear the wind whistling through the gap, but beneath that, soft, deliberate speech. I stepped closer, my ear almost touching the wood. A woman's voice emerged, trembling, fearful. "Don't look for him, you'll only find what's left," I shivered. The voice faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the echoing wind. I wondered if I had imagined it entirely, but the feeling of being watched remained, insistent and heavy. The street curved slightly, and I found myself near the old church at the town's edge. Its steeple leaned precariously, and the windows were darkened with grime. But the wind here carried the clearest whispers yet, as though the building had collected decades of prayers, confessions, and secrets. I could hear snippets of sermons, arguments, last words. Mercy, forgiveness, blood on their hands. The voices overlapped, creating a dissonant melody of memory, guilt, and despair. I stepped closer to the church, and the whispers coalesced into a strange cadence, almost like sentences forming, though fragmented. I caught pieces of one particularly vivid story, a miner lost in a shaft, calling for help while others ignored him, a family struck by fire while neighbors watched, a young woman trapped in a bedroom as someone crept outside her door. The wind carried each tale with such intimacy. It was as if the town demanded I know them, demanded I feel their pain as acutely as the living once had. I wandered the surrounding yards, brushing past tombstones that had been brought here from the cemetery long ago, moved during some old ritual or construction. The wind wrapped around me, tugging gently at my coat and hair, and the voices persisted. They no longer felt like whispers. They were memories attempting to escape, stories that wanted to be heard before fading entirely. I found myself speaking softly, even though no one was there, repeating fragments of sentences aloud, as if acknowledging them would somehow honor their weight. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the town. The wind picked up again, stronger now, carrying voices that seemed urgent, almost pleading. Remember, tell them, don't let it die. I could feel the story settling over me like a blanket, heavy and suffocating, yet compelling. My mind wandered to the lives behind these tragedies, the moments of fear, grief, and betrayal. Each step through the town was a step into memory. Each gust of wind, a carrier of human experience preserved beyond mortality. I paused on a corner, leaning against the side of a collapsed building. The wind swirled, and the voices joined together in a soft, mournful chorus. I could not distinguish the beginnings from the ends, the names from the events, the living from the dead. It all blended into a tapestry of sorrow, stitched together by time and memory. The town was speaking through the wind, a whispering archive of everything it had witnessed, demanding that no detail be forgotten. I realized then that I had become part of the record. My footsteps, my presence, my listening. It was all absorbed into the town's fabric. The wind carried my own reactions, my own fear, my own wonder, as if the town wished to record not just what had happened, but also those who bore witness. And I knew in that moment that leaving would not erase me. I had entered its memory, and it would follow me, whispering in corners, rustling through trees, curling around me in moments of silence. As I began to make my way back toward the edge of town, the sun nearly set, the shadows stretching long and strange. I felt the weight of the wind stories pressing closer. I could hear them everywhere now, in the gaps between buildings, the spaces under roofs, the cracks in the pavement. Names, dates, unfinished sentences, all carried by the wind, insistent, inescapable. I shivered, the chill not entirely from the air, and quickened my pace, though the whispers seemed to follow, patient, persistent, unyielding. By the time I reached the outskirts, the voices had grown faint, drifting back into the hills and the empty streets, though I knew they had not left. The town had returned to silence, but it was a silence dense with memory. I glanced back once, and for a brief instant the wind shifted as if to carry one last message. We wait, we remember, and you will too. I left the town behind that evening, my mind heavy with stories I had not lived but now somehow carried. The voices in the wind would follow me, settling in my ears during quiet nights, reminding me that even in places abandoned, the echoes of the past persist, and some memories refuse to fade. The town itself had become a storyteller, and I, unwillingly, had become its witness. I turned away from the heart of the town slowly, reluctant to leave, as if stepping away from the shadows would erase some fragile understanding I had barely begun to grasp. The wind had settled into a low hum, brushing across the crumbling rooftops and rattling loose boards. My footsteps on the gravel and broken pavement felt unnaturally loud, each crunch ringing sharply in the stillness. It was late afternoon now, though the sun hung low, casting long fingers of light across the empty streets. I told myself I would leave quickly, get to the edge of the hill where the road curved toward the highway. I wanted to believe that the ghosts, the memories, the whispers were tied only to the town itself. That once I was past the last house, past the rickety fences and overgrown gardens, the echoes would fade, leaving me with nothing but the wind. But even as I walked, a weight pressed at the back of my mind, a subtle unease that whispered I was not alone. The street was empty. I could see the outlines of abandoned homes, their windows staring like dark, unblinking eyes. Broken fences leaned into the weeds and faded paint peeled in long strips from the boards. A swing in a yard creaked gently in the breeze, though I could see no rope attached to it. I imagined a child sitting there long ago, laughing once before disappearing entirely from the frame of this world. The thought clung to me, a whisper in my own mind. And then I heard it, the first footstep. It was soft, deliberate, measured. I froze mid-step, straining to listen. My own shoes shifted slightly on the gravel, and for a moment I thought the sound had come from me. But no, there was another step, perfectly timed with the rhythm of mine, though distant, almost too light to belong to a human. I stopped completely, listening. The town was silent except for the whispering wind, but the steps continued, following me. There was no pattern I could discern, just the steady cadence behind me, moving across the cracked pavement. I turned slowly, trying to see who or what might be there. Nothing. Only the shadows stretching long in the dying light. My heartbeat sped up. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks, the loose boards of the abandoned houses, or perhaps a stray animal somewhere in the overgrown lots. Rational thoughts clashed with instinctual fear. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was being watched, followed, hunted, not by something alive necessarily, but by something aware, something patient. I started walking again, faster this time, but carefully, not wanting to run and draw attention to myself. The footsteps matched me, always just behind, echoing the rhythm of my movement. I tried a few quick turns, zigzagging down side alleys, but the sound remained. There was no door, no corner, no shadow I could pinpoint. The presence felt intangible, yet real, a constant weight pressing from just beyond my awareness. I thought of the stories I had overheard in the wind, the whispers of crimes and tragedies. Maybe the town did not allow its memory to leave with its visitors. Maybe it attached itself to those who had listened too closely, followed too far into the quiet streets. The notion made me shiver. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the ground itself bore witness to my passage, recording each movement, each faltering breath. I reached the old general store at the edge of the street. Its door hung open, swinging slightly, and the windows were clouded with dust and streaks of rain from years past. I paused at the threshold, considering whether to enter or keep moving. The wind seemed to gather here, carrying something different this time, a low, murmuring hum, almost like voices singing softly under their breath. A step sounded behind me, close this time. I spun, heart hammering, and the street was empty. The shadows of the buildings stretched long, distorted by the angle of the sun, but there was no one there. And yet I felt it, a presence just beyond sight, moving in tandem with me. I realized with a cold clarity that leaving the town might not free me from it. I pressed on, moving toward the hill where the road climbed and the first glimpse of the open landscape would appear. My legs were tense, every muscle coiled with fear. The footsteps behind me continued, though irregular now, sometimes pausing, sometimes quickening in rhythm. I dared not look over my shoulder for long. To do so felt like inviting whatever it was to step fully into view. The town fell away gradually as I climbed. The streets grew narrower, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris, and the buildings thinner, smaller, until I was walking past a row of collapsed walls that seemed like ruins of homes that had never truly existed. The wind blew harder here, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth. And still, the footsteps followed. I paused at the crest of the hill, the open landscape stretching before me in muted shades of gray and green. The horizon was blurred, softened by the fading sunlight, and the town below looked fragile, like a memory about to vanish entirely. I breathed in deeply, trying to steady myself. Perhaps if I slowed, if I walked with intention rather than fear, the presence would dissipate. Perhaps it only existed for those who fled blindly. I took another step. Behind me, the sound of shoes hitting gravel came again, but this time it was unmistakable. A clear, deliberate pace that mirrored mine exactly. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I looked back, scanning the slope and the faint outlines of the street below. No one, no figure. Only the town, quiet and unresponsive. And yet the footsteps persisted, constant and unyielding. I whispered aloud, trying to break the spell. I am leaving, I am leaving. My own voice sounded foreign, swallowed by the wind, and for a brief moment the footsteps faltered. I dared a glance behind me, expecting to see a shadow, a shape, anything tangible, but the street remained empty. The wind shifted then, a sudden gust that carried a chorus of faint whispers from the town below. I recognized fragments of names, fragments of events I had heard earlier, the lost children, the vanished families, the unspoken horrors. They were not warning me, they were claiming me, reminding me that the stories I had witnessed were not entirely gone. I continued up the hill, slow and deliberate, each step weighted with awareness. The presence behind me seemed to ebb slightly, though I could not be sure if it was truly fading or if my mind had adjusted to its rhythm. The wind tugged at my clothing, whispering through my hair, and I imagined it speaking to the unseen watcher, a soft acknowledgement that I had heard, that I had understood. The road curved sharply and I could see the highway in the distance. The open landscape promised safety, a return to the ordinary, a departure from the town's clinging memories. And yet the footsteps persisted, not every step, but enough to remind me that the town, or whatever lingered with it, was still there, still aware of me, still waiting. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the feeling of eyes on my back, of consciousness tracking mine. But the wind and the whispers seemed to follow, stretching across the fields and colliding with the open air, carrying remnants of the town's memory even into emptier spaces. I realized then that leaving the hill would not entirely sever the connection. The town had left a mark on me, inscribed in the rhythm of the footsteps and the murmurs in the wind. Finally, the slope leveled and the distant hum of traffic suggested the world beyond. I paused, looking back once more. The town appeared smaller now, fragile against the expanse of sky and earth, almost like a diorama. The shadows of the buildings stretched long, leaning as if watching me depart. I could not see the footsteps, but the sensation of being followed remained, persistent and intangible. I stepped onto the highway at last, my shoes crunching over gravel and asphalt. The wind carried the town's whispers with it, fading slowly, though never entirely. I glanced back again, half expecting a figure to emerge from the mist. Nothing moved, but the unease clung tightly, a reminder that I had been part of something larger, something patient and enduring. Even as I walked toward the approaching headlights and the promise of ordinary life, I knew the town, and whatever had lingered in its streets, would follow me in ways I could not yet measure. The footsteps were gone, or perhaps they had merely retreated to the edges of my mind. But the sense of being observed, remembered, and recorded would stay. I would carry it with me for days, months, perhaps years, a whispering echo of hollow points memories. And so I left the hill behind, but I understood with a clarity both terrifying and mesmerizing that some places never truly release you. They mark you, trace you, and continue to watch through the quiet spaces that follow. Hollow Point, its wind, its shadows, and its stories had claimed me in a way I could never undo.